Hey guys, tonight we're plunging headfirst into a not-so-gentle parade of royal disasters, a gallery of rulers who met ends so bizarre, so stomach-churningly odd, that you'll question how these people ever made it onto coins. Picture this: you're walking through a damp medieval corridor lit by sputtering torchlight, the scent of tallow thick in the air. A servant scuttles past with a platter of something fishy. No, literally fishy. Welcome to the court of King Henry VI of England, where the main course is lamprey, and moderation has left the building. You probably won't survive this either, not the lampreys, but the audacity of royal decision-making. It's like trying to do taxes during a sword fight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Midnight in Melbourne, noon in New Jersey, I see you, insomniacs. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive just as the platters are being carried in brass trays lined with steaming silver bowls, the smell hitting you like a tidal wave of pond water and garlic. The royal cooks are in a frenzy, shouting in 3 languages and arguing over seasoning while a small fire tries to eat the drapes behind them. A court musician plinks lazily at a harp, clearly wondering whether this gig will end in payment or execution. At the head of the long, echoing hall sits King Henry III, younger son of William the Conqueror, and a man with the digestive restraint of a goat in a vegetable patch. Known for his administrative genius and ability to produce illegitimate children like it was a competitive sport, Henry has one true, deep weakness: lampreys. Lampreys are the culinary equivalent of a dare. Long, jawless, and somewhere between a fish and a worm, they were inexplicably beloved by the medieval elite. You're told they taste like a mix of catfish and bad decisions. But the king, he's obsessed. He has them imported, soaked in wine, boiled with spices, and arranged like squirming little trophies in bowls that steam with decadence. And despite repeated warnings from his physicians who suggest, ever so gently, that maybe the king should consider not eating what his stomach seems to classify as enemy combatants, Henry goes all in. Tonight, he gorges. Zoom in: the flickering torchlight glistens on his beard as he raises yet another dripping piece of lamprey to his lips, his eyes glazed with pleasure and wine. The entire hall watches with that special kind of courtier dread, half hoping he enjoys it, half terrified he'll choke and blame the nearest noble. The meal continues for hours. Platters are refilled, goblets are drained. The harpist starts playing faster, maybe in fear. Eventually, Henry's face tightens. He frowns. Not in anger, but in pain. He pushes back from the table and grips his middle. Later, someone will swear he muttered, "I should have listened to the doctors," which, if true, is possibly the most British deathbed confession ever uttered. What follows is a slow-motion disaster. He retires to bed with what he assumes is indigestion. But the moans coming from the royal chamber grow louder. Servants rush for physicians, who appear carrying boxes of herbal concoctions and hopeful expressions. Leeches are applied, purges are ordered. A syrup of crushed herbs and wine is spooned past his lips. It does not help. The scent of damp stone and rotting apples thickens the room. Somewhere in the distance, a chapel bell begins to toll too early to be a death knell, but just ominous enough to raise eyebrows. Over the next few days, his condition worsens. By the 4th day, Henry is barely coherent. A monk records his final words as something like, "God will judge me," though the ink is smudged and might also read, "God will fudge me." Historians are still debating the true phrase. Not that it matters either way. The king soon dies, likely of food poisoning so aggressive it could have been weaponized. There's a strange quiet afterward. The court, unsure what to do, falls into a kind of stunned muttering. No one wants to be the first to move. Eventually, a servant begins the solemn process of preparing the body, and the torches are lowered. The smell of lamprey lingers like a greasy ghost, and no one touches the leftovers. The chroniclers, ever poetic, declare that Henry died of a surfeit of lampreys. That's a fancy way of saying, dude ate himself to death. Historians today still scratch their heads. Was it really just food poisoning? Some suspect a hidden illness, perhaps dysentery, or a stomach ulcer finally torn open by one eel too many. Others float the idea of poison. though there's little evidence of foul play, is just so perfectly absurd. The king who survived battles, plots, rebellions, and dynastic chaos, undone by a plate of oily aquatic noodles. Zoom in again, the royal physician drops the last cloth into the wash basin, shaking his head. I told him. Outside the chamber, a courtier is already whispering about succession. A bishop pulls out a dusty family tree and looks confused, and confused they remain. Henry II's only legitimate son had drowned years earlier in the tragic White Ship disaster, leaving behind a daughter, Empress Matilda, whose claim to the throne was immediately contested. Within months, England slides into the anarchy, a brutal civil war that lasts nearly 20 years, all because a king couldn't say no to a fish. You linger by the firelight, the scent of damp stone mingling with ash and oil, as servants shuffle by with downcast eyes. You half expect the corpse to rise up and demand dessert, but no, Henry is gone. The torch nearest the bed sputters once, then flares back to life, and just beyond the door, someone is screaming, something about a staircase. History, my friend, never digests quietly. You hear it before you see it, a thud that doesn't echo like wood or iron. You hear it before you see it, a thud that doesn't echo like wood or iron or stone, but something softer, something living. The kind of sound that only comes from a body meeting a surface that never planned to catch it. You follow the noise, drawn down a narrow corridor lit with wall torches barely strong enough to fight back the dark. Their flames jitter like nervous whispers. The scent of damp stone thickens. It clings to your tongue like cold soot, and then you see him. At the bottom of the winding staircase, tangled in the folds of his imperial robes, lies Tsar Peter III of Russia, sprawled like a discarded puppet, limbs twisted, one shoe missing. A faint trail of blood snakes along a stone step, glinting in the firelight like melted rubies. His powdered wig has slid half off his scalp. He doesn't look like a man who slipped. He looks like a man who was erased. Peter III, if you didn't already guess, was not exactly built for the crown. Ruling Russia for just over 6 months in 1762, his reign was a chaotic cocktail of bad ideas, misplaced loyalties, and spectacular political clumsiness. He was the grandson of Peter the Great, which probably felt like being asked to follow Shakespeare at an open mic night, and he failed spectacularly. He adored Prussia, he played with toy soldiers, he offended nobles and clergy in equal measure, he hated traditional Russian customs and, with unflinching genius, proposed replacing the Russian army's uniforms with German ones. In Russia, imagine someone showing up to a Texan barbecue with tofu and a British accent and asking everyone to please stop shooting into the sky. That was Peter. Well-meaning, maybe, but wildly off-key. Still, it wasn't just his awkward policies that sealed his fate. It was his wife, Catherine. Catherine the Great didn't start out with great in her name, but she earned it with a level of cunning that could slice diamonds. Born Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess, she'd married Peter for politics, not romance. While Peter focused on drills and insults, Catherine focused on strategy. She studied Enlightenment philosophy, made allies of powerful nobles, and kept her eyes wide open. By July of 1762, she was done waiting. While Peter loafed around the country estate of Ropshire inebriated, distracted, and about as secure as a paper umbrella in a thunderstorm, Catherine staged a bloodless coup. The Imperial Guard supported her. The clergy blessed her. The capital shrugged and cheered. Peter was dethroned before he'd even realized he was in danger. His surrender was almost laughably fast. He allegedly signed his abdication without a fuss and asked, perhaps too optimistically, if he could simply retire with his violin. Instead, he was taken to Ropshire, still technically alive but no longer useful. A prisoner under comfortable watch for about a week. Zoom in candlelight flickers against stone. You feel the temperature drop slightly as you step toward the bottom of the stairs. Peter's body is crumpled in a way that suggests not clumsiness, but intention. One of the guards above shifts uneasily, eyes darting toward you, then back to the shadows. The official explanation, hemorrhoidal colic. A diagnosis so vague and oddly specific that even his enemies raised an eyebrow. Other accounts mention a drunken brawl with a guard. One says he was strangled. A more theatrical version suggests he begged for his life before being quietly smothered. None of the reports quite agree, but they all share the same undertone: this was no accident. Historians still argue whether Catherine herself ordered the execution or simply turned her back long enough for someone else to do the wet work. Was it premeditated or just convenient? We may never know, but dead is dead, and Peter III was very dead. Catherine didn't attend the funeral. She had an empire to run. Her first months as empress were a flurry of reforms, manifestos, and subtle but undeniable brilliance. She secured Russia's western borders, improved education, and launched ambitious architectural campaigns. She wrote, she ruled, she endured, and Peter was erased as efficiently as a smudge on glass. Except, not entirely, years later. After Catherine died in 1796, her son Paul, the only legitimate child of Peter III, ascended the throne. And Paul had opinions. He despised his mother for what she'd done, idolized the father he never truly knew, and in one of history's more dramatic acts of passive-aggressive retribution, Paul ordered his father's body exhumed and reburied with full royal honours. It was an imperial production music, soldiers, golden sarcophagi. He even forced Prince Orloff, Catherine's former lover and a rumoured conspirator in Peter's death, to carry the coffin. Zoom in again, the scent of incense clogs your nose as you stand near the ceremonial procession. Peter's painted likeness peers down from a newly commissioned portrait, dressed in regalia he never wore with dignity in life. It's surreal, this sudden inflation of legacy, like watching someone get posthumously promoted to most valuable player after bench-warming the entire season. Still, even with the reburial, the strange fog around Peter's life never lifted. Some historians defend him, arguing he was a misunderstood reformer trapped by circumstance. Others see him as a tragic clown, destined for disaster. Was he naive, arrogant, simply unlucky, or just born into a world that demanded lions? When all he brought was a wooden sabre and a horn, you step back from the stairwell. The torchlight behind you flickers again, nervous, like it's heard something it wishes it could forget. The scent of damp stone lingers thick in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a crow caws, and a gust of wind stirs the dust on the floor. Peter III lies still. Catherine is already rewriting the empire. But your night isn't over yet, because next you're about to witness a royal death that takes place in the least majestic location imaginable. Prepare yourself for tiled walls, a sudden cramp, and one very unlucky flush. There's a chill in the hallway now, not the noble kind, like crisp alpine air, but the clammy kind, like someone left a window open in a morgue. Your boots thud softly on the worn stones as you turn a corner and walk straight into a gust of something sharp and human. Not blood, not perfume, something worse. It's the unmistakable tang of panic, sweat, and a royal bowel emergency. Welcome to the final moments of King George III of Great Britain, the only English monarch to ever die on the toilet and not in some grand, metaphorical sense. We mean literally on the toilet and not in some grand, metaphorical sense. We mean literally on the toilet, in his royal privy, trousers around ankles, heart full of determination, colon full of regret. It's October 25th, 1760. The morning is grey and fussy, with clouds hanging over Kensington Palace like bad omens in powdered wigs. The scent of overcooked meat pies clings to the air. Courtiers stir tea with silver spoons, unaware that their king is about to exit the throne in the most undignified way possible. You climb the creaky staircase leading to the king's chambers, where the polished oak gives way to marble flooring. A valet stands outside the royal water closet, eyes wide, fists clenched. Something is wrong. You knock. No response. Inside, George II sits slumped forward on what historians politely call a close stool. In less dainty terms, it's a fancy wooden box with a padded lid and a ceramic chamber pot hidden beneath. Fit for a king until it wasn't. George was in his late 70s, stubborn as a goose with a grudge, and still clinging to the idea that he was a sprightly military man. But his body had been sending signals for months. His heart, in particular, had developed a rhythm best described as jazz but deadly. He'd suffered chest pains, dizziness, and occasional collapses. Physicians of the day called it wind, because medical terminology in the 1700s was just a collection of polite guesses. On that fateful morning, the king rose early. He drank his chocolate. He paced a little. Then he retired to his private toilet for what he probably assumed would be an unremarkable moment of digestive diplomacy. Instead, he groaned loudly, then gasped. Then, according to the terrified servant outside, collapsed forward with a sound like a heavy sack of wet mail. The noise startled nearby attendants, who burst through the door moments later to find their sovereign dead pants down, eyes wide, head resting against the side of the chamber pot. Zoom in. The room smells of lavender water, stale upholstery, and something darker, an acidic tang that hangs in the throat. The king's wig lies askew on the floor. A small bluebird, kept as a pet in a cage by the window, chirps once and falls silent. George III, King of Great Britain and Ireland, Elector of Hanover, conqueror of armies, keeper of order, has died of an aortic aneurysm while relieving himself. The irony is almost too perfect. For decades, George had cultivated the image of a soldier king gruff, no nonsense, and prone to shouting at his ministers in German-accented English. He was the last British monarch to personally lead troops into battle at the Battle of Dettingen in 1743. He loved order, punctuality, and long walks in the garden, often muttering to himself about Parliament and pickled herring. His rule wasn't exactly glamorous, but it was stable. Mostly. Historians still debate whether his death was instantaneous or drawn out over a few gasping minutes. Some suspect the strain of defecation triggered the rupture, a phenomenon now medically recognized as defecation syncope. Yes, it's a real thing. Too much effort, too little blood to the brain, and lights out. It's horrifying, and oddly relatable. Royals, after all, are just humans in fancier shoes. And nothing screams mortality louder than dying mid-poop. The court, naturally, went into a mild panic. Queen Caroline had already died years earlier, but his children, especially his grandson, the future George III, were rushed to his side. Parliament was informed, doctors were summoned to confirm the obvious, and then came the hardest part, figuring out how to report the death without admitting how it happened. Zoom in again. A royal scribe scratches his quill across parchment, pausing awkwardly before writing the phrase "died suddenly of natural causes." Not exactly a lie, but nowhere near the full truth. Despite the embarrassment, George II's death marked the end of a certain era in British monarchy. He was the last monarch buried at Westminster Abbey. His son, Frederick, had predeceased him after being struck in the chest with a cricket ball, because history has range. So the throne passed directly to his grandson George III. Yes, that George III, the one who would go on to lose the American colonies, collect mental health diagnoses like stamps, and spent his later years talking to trees. But for now, all eyes were on the funeral. George the Kid was buried beside Queen Caroline in Westminster, under a shared monument of stunning marble, and in a final, oddly romantic twist, he'd instructed the sides of their coffins be removed so they could lie together in death, side by side, unconstrained even by their separate tombs. A gentle gesture for a man whose life had been marked by sternness, spitfire, and one very unfortunate exit. Historians still debate the specifics of his collapse. Did he fall forward? Backward? Did he cry out? Did he clutch his chest or the edge of the stool? But one thing is certain, he remains the only British monarch to have died while seated, pants down, in what could generously be called the kingdom's least photogenic room. You linger at the threshold of the royal privy, torchlight dancing on the glossy marble, the air unusually still. The faint scent of lavender fails to fully mask the sour truth beneath. You back away slowly, careful not to touch anything, because the next monarch you're about to meet, let's just say, he doesn't go out quietly. In fact, he goes out loud, with a bang, a literal one. And if you thought this death was undignified, you haven't seen what happens when a royal funeral turns into a pressure cooker. You step into the chapel cautiously, the soles of your shoes whispering against the cold stone floor. The smell hits you first, something heavy and syrupy, the kind of sweetness that isn't sweet at all. Roses crushed underfoot, mixed with sweat and something meatier, old perfume layered over rot. It creeps into your nose, clings to your tongue. At the front of the church, lit by smoky shafts of sunlight piercing through stained glass, stands a coffin, a large one, thick, iron-banded, and slightly too squat. Around it, priests in heavy robes chant prayers that rise and fall like distant waves. Their voices echo off the vaulted ceiling, but no one looks relaxed. Several are visibly sweating. One keeps swallowing hard. Another, closer to the coffin, flinches every time it creaks. Welcome to the funeral of William the Conqueror, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and freshly deceased heavyweight champion of royal bloat. You wouldn't expect the man who changed the course of English history to leave the world like this. You wouldn't expect his death to involve swelling, spontaneous combustion, and a coffin that sounded like it was holding back a poltergeist. But here we are. Let's rewind a bit. William of England, also known as William the Bastard, before the Battle of Hastings earned him a more flattering nickname, wasn't born to win. Illegitimate, underestimated, and surrounded by plotting nobles who would have gladly stabbed him with a fish fork for the chance at power. William grew up fast and hard in Normandy. By age 8, he'd inherited the duchy. By his early 20s, he'd learned to out-scheme assassins and outride warlords. When he set his sights on England in 1066, people laughed. They weren't laughing long. William crushed King Harold II at the Battle of Hastings, famously aided by a well-placed arrow to Harold's eye and an extremely motivated cavalry. He took the English crown, launched a brutal wave of castle building, and introduced a system of taxation so efficient it made future generations of peasants cry in 4 languages. Zoom in. You walk past one of those castles on your way to the funeral. Thick walls, narrow slits for archers, the scent of damp moss and boiled leather wafting from within. William's England is solid, structured, cold, but toward the end of his life, the conqueror slowed. Not his ambition, just his body. He'd grown large, and not the kind of medieval kingly large, big. Contemporary chroniclers describe him as great of body, subtle. Rumours suggested he was difficult to move, prone to digestive complaints, and always sweating. He took to his meals with ferocity. Feasting was still a performance in medieval courts, and William gave it the full show. In 1087, while campaigning in Normandy to quell a rebellion because of course he was, William set fire to the city of Mantes, but as he rode through the smoking ruins like a wrathful Santa Claus, his horse stumbled. William lurched forward and slammed hard onto the iron pommel of his saddle. The result, a severe abdominal injury. Sources suggest a rupture, or possibly internal bruising that led to swelling and infection. Either way, it was bad. Really bad. He was carried to Rouen, placed in a bed far too small, and left to stew quite literally. His condition worsened over the next few weeks. His belly swelled. His skin grew hot and tight. The room, once dimly lit and cool, became a kind of pressure cooker, filled with the constant murmurs of priests, the scraping of bowls filled with leech water, and the groans of a dying king. He tried to repent. He gave land to the church. He apologized to his enemies, or at least to the ones still breathing. The scent of incense filled the room, though it didn't quite mask the other scent, something fermenting. Zoom in again. You stand near the window. The torches burn low. A monk mutters a psalm under his breath while gently fanning the king with a strip of parchment. William stares blankly at the ceiling, mouth slightly open, body shifting under the weight of his own decay. And then on the morning of September 9th, he dies. The moment his last breath escapes, his attendants scatter, literally. Nobles bolt for the doors, servants run to secure their next jobs, and the monks are left standing over a body that's already starting to groan. You see, William's reputation outlived his body by several days. The priests scrambled to arrange a burial. His chosen site, the Abbey of Saint-Étienne in Caen, a fitting place. Except, they hadn't finished preparing the tomb. Also, no one had considered what happens when you let a body bloat in August heat while wrapped in layers of royal fabric. Transporting him was a problem. Fitting him into the stone sarcophagus was worse. According to one monk, it was clear the body was too large for the space prepared. That's polite speak for, this coffin is going to explode. And explode it did. At the funeral, just as the clergy tried to force the lid shut. The pressure inside William's body finally gave up. With a sickening wet pop like a bursting wineskin, his abdomen ruptured. Gases and fluids sprayed out with enough force to crack the coffin lid and send mourners fleeing from the abbey in horror. The stench was unspeakable. People gagged. Some fainted. The monks continued the funeral as best they could, waving incense and reciting Latin over what was essentially a royal biohazard. Imagine it nobles in silken fur, choking on the king's final exhalation. The abbey's stone walls echoing with both Gregorian chants and gagging, candles toppling, priests muttering prayers through clenched teeth, nostrils pinched shut. One chronicler described it bluntly: a loathsome stench assailed the nostrils of all present. You don't say, today. Only a thigh bone remains of William's body wars and revolutions soar to the rest. But the legend of that funeral lingers like the scent it left behind. Historians still debate the cause of the explosion. Was it poor embalming, the heat, the coffin's tight seal? Some blame the monks for waiting too long. Others argue the king's health had already been failing for months and that internal rot had set in before he even died. But whatever the cause, William the Conqueror's death taught the medieval world two things: never delay a funeral. Don't skimp on coffin ventilation. You step away from the sarcophagus now. The air in the abbey feels cooler, but that lingering scent, floral, bitter, and faintly metallic, follows you down the corridor. You pass beneath a cracked archway, where sunlight casts fractured patterns on the ground. Dust motes drift through the air like tiny ghosts. Behind you, the church is quiet again, but the memory of that detonation, that unholy pop, follows. You breathe through your mouth, trying to clear your thoughts, and head toward the exit. Because next you're not inside a chapel or a throne room, you're in a forest. It's quiet. Too quiet, and the next king. Well, he never saw it coming. The forest is quiet. Too quiet. You've stepped out of stone walls and candlelight and into something far older. Older than kingdoms. Older than kings. The kind of quiet that clings to your ears and makes your heartbeat sound suspicious. Overhead, the canopy filters sunlight into mottled gold. Beneath your feet, the ground is damp, soft, and perfumed with pine needles, crushed leaves, and the unmistakable earthiness of moss-covered secrets. You follow a trail that winds between ancient oaks, their bark scarred by time and weather and something you can't name. Up ahead, a small hunting party moves through the underbrush. Leather creaks, hooves scuff the soil. Laughter echoes once short, sharp, maybe forced. One rider turns in the saddle. That's him. King William II of England, better known as William Rufus. Rufus for the colour of his face or his hair, or maybe just his temper sources vary. But what they agree on is this: he was not a king who inspired warm bedtime stories. It's August 2nd, 1100, and Rufus is about to take his last ride through this cursed woodland. William Rufus wasn't exactly popular. His reign followed that of his legendary father, William the Conqueror, which meant the bar was higher than his hairline. Where his father built an empire, William taxed it. Where others were pious, William was irreverent. He argued with the church, mocked bishops, and filled his court with laughter that often came at someone else's expense. He also refused to marry or produce an heir, much to the dismay of everyone with a family tree to climb. Instead, he ruled with a certain chaotic indifference. Gold was hoarded, justice was a coin toss, and no one felt entirely safe near the man with the sharp tongue and sharper arrows. Today, he's hunting, and not metaphorically. The new forest sprawls before him, lush, shadowy, oddly still. A royal hunting ground established by his father years earlier. It's a place where nobles chase deer and pretend politics don't exist. But this forest has a reputation. 2 of William the Conqueror's sons had already died within its boundaries, one crushed by a horse, another mysteriously fallen. Locals whispered that the land had never forgiven the Normans for seizing it, that the very soil rebelled. The new forest, they said, takes back what it's owed. Today, it wants a king. William rides with several companions, among them Walter Tyrrell, a French nobleman with a bow known to be deadly accurate. Tyrrell had no real quarrel with William, or so it seemed. But then again, no quarrel in royal circles is often just code for "I'm biding my time." As the group disperses to flush out deer, the king rides deeper into the woods. His red cloak flaps behind him like a warning flag. The light dims. The trees grow closer. Zoom in, the king raises his bow, eyes narrowing. A deer leaps in the distance, a white tail flashing. From behind a twisted elm, another arrow flies, not his. There's a sickening sound. Not a snap. Not a crack. More like a heavy thud, like someone slamming a wet book against a table. William Rufus jolts in the saddle, a look of utter confusion frozen on his face. He lets out a noise, half grunt, half question, before toppling sideways and landing on the forest floor with a thump that seems to silence even the birds. An arrow juts from his chest, right below the sternum. Deep, final. Walter Tyrrell is gone before the body cools. The king's other attendants scatter in confusion. By the time anyone returns to retrieve the body, it's hours later. The king lies where he fell, blood soaked into the moss, flies beginning to gather. No royal guard, no sombre trumpet. Just a wooden cart and a peasant who probably had other plans that day. Zoom in again. Just a wooden cart and a peasant who probably had other plans that day. Zoom in again, the cart creaks as it rolls toward Winchester. Rufus's body muddy, lifeless, ignored, bounces with each bump. His arm dangles. One boot has come loose. The wheel sticks briefly in a rut before snapping free. No honour guard, no royal fanfare. Historians have argued for centuries over what exactly happened in the New Forest that day. Walter Tyrrell insisted it was an accident that the king moved suddenly into the path of a shot meant for a deer. But strangely, he fled the country within 24 hours, never returning to answer questions. An innocent man might protest. Tyrrell ran. And then there's Henry William's younger brother, who just so happened to be in the hunting party that day, and who, within 2 days, had claimed the treasury at Winchester and declared himself king. That's faster than a modern Wi-Fi connection. Was it a conspiracy? A convenient accident? A cursed forest doing its annual clean-up? Historians still debate it. Some point to Henry's suspiciously smooth coronation, others to William's political recklessness. And then there are those who believe the land itself simply had its say. Whatever the cause, the result was the same: a king struck down not in battle, not in bed, but in the middle of the woods, with no witnesses and no justice. His grave at Winchester Cathedral is marked with a stone that has cracked down the middle, as if the very weight of his story couldn't be contained. Even today, locals say the site is haunted, that a figure in red still roams the New Forest at dusk, always just ahead, always vanishing behind a tree. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe the forest still remembers, and as you walk the same trail now, the shadows seem to press in. The canopy thickens. You hear the snap of a twig behind you, and for a moment, you freeze. But it's just the wind. Probably. You keep walking, heart steadying, because your night isn't over yet, the next royal death. It doesn't happen in the woods, or in battle, or at a banquet. It happens in a royal bedroom with a queen, a lover, and a duel so tragic it took down a dynasty before the sun could rise. The scent changes as you leave the woods. Pine gives way to perfume, moss to musk. The flickering torchlight of castle corridors returns dancing now across marble floors, silk curtains, and gilt frame mirrors that reflect too much and reveal too little. Your boots no longer squish through forest mulch. Now they click softly, politely, across polished stone. You're in a palace again, somewhere warm, somewhere French, and someone very important is breathing her last upstairs. This isn't a story about illness, or age, or accidents. This is a story about love, power, and one monumentally bad decision. Because tonight you're standing outside the bedchamber of Queen Caroline Matilda of Denmark, and she's about to die of heartbreak, but not in the way poets mean it. It's 1775. The Enlightenment is blooming across Europe. Ideas are changing. Monarchies are wobbling under the weight of thinkers and revolutionaries. But Denmark is caught in a royal fever dream. Queen Caroline Matilda, sister of King George III of Britain, had been married off at age 15 to King Christian VII of Denmark, a man barely older and already unravelling. Christian was handsome, eccentric, and deeply troubled. Most historians now believe he suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but in the 18th century they called it madness and left it at that. He drank too much, he screamed at shadows, he disappeared for days into bouts of mania or crushing silence. And when he did speak, it was often to parrots or the ghosts he imagined in the royal drapes, which left Caroline young, intelligent, and very alone. Enter Johann Friedrich Struensee, a German doctor, Enlightenment thinker, handsome, confident, and disturbingly good at massaging both egos and shoulder tension. Hired originally as Christian's physician, he quickly became the king's confidant and then the queen's everything. Zoom in. You stand at the edge of a long candlelit hallway. A door is ajar. Inside, whispers and laughter. The queen's slipper dangles from one foot. Her fingers rest lightly on the doctor's wrist. Outside, a storm rumbles low, slow and judgmental. Their affair is no secret. And strangely, no one seems to care at first. Struensee controls the king, or at least, he steers him, calms him with tonics, keeps him distracted with shiny things. Under Struensee's influence, Denmark becomes a laboratory of Enlightenment reform. Serfdom begins to unravel, censorship is lifted, public health measures appear, the kingdom stirs with possibility. Caroline glows. She bears a daughter, Louise Augusta, whom everyone strongly suspects belongs to the doctor, not the king. Christian, predictably, doesn't notice, or doesn't care, but power, like perfume, never stays unnoticed for long. By 1772, the whispers reach the wrong ears specifically. Dowager Queen Juliana Maria, Christian's stepmother, a woman with a face like cold bread and a will sharper than a guillotine. She sees the affair. She sees the reforms. She sees the shift of power away from her family, and she decides, firmly, that all of this must stop. On the night of January 17th, while the city sleeps under snow and gaslight, Struensee is arrested in his nightshirt. He's dragged from his chambers, still smelling of ink and clove cigarettes. Caroline Matilda is taken shortly after, her hair undone, her wrists trembling with disbelief. Zoom in again. The Queen is marched through a private corridor. Behind her, the faint sob of her daughter echoes through the marble. A guard looks away. One does not meet the eyes of a woman whose life is being peeled away in layers. Struensee is imprisoned, interrogated, and tortured, though politely, in that uniquely horrifying 18th century style. He confesses everything, whether truthfully or not. No one can say. The trial is swift. He is convicted of treason and sentenced to death. And here is where it turns from tragedy to opera. On April 28, 1772, Johann Friedrich Struensee is executed publicly, not by sword, not by musket, but by the wheel. A punishment so brutal it was usually reserved for commoners and dramatic folk legends. First, his right hand is cut off, then his body is shattered on the wheel, one limb at a time. The executioner works methodically. The crowd watches, unsure whether to be outraged or impressed. Struensee dies without a scream, which some take as bravery, others as shock. His remains are burned and scattered, as if Denmark itself wanted no relics of reform. Caroline Matilda. She is exiled, shipped away like dangerous cargo to the town of Chell in Hanover, Germany, far from court, far from her children, and far from anything resembling comfort. She's only 21 years old. For 3 years, she lives quietly, writes letters, walks in the garden, reads Enlightenment texts she once helped bring to Denmark. She never sees her children again. Louise Augusta grows up in the Danish court, always whispered about, never quite embraced. Then, in May 775, Caroline falls ill. Some say it's scarlet fever, others think it was tuberculosis. A few suspect poison after all. Her continued existence was politically inconvenient. What's certain is that her decline is sudden, swift. 1 week. She's strolling the garden paths. The next. She's coughing blood into lace. Zoom in one last time. She lies in bed, the sheets crisp, the light dim. Her maid dabs her forehead. Outside, the wind stirs the lilacs. Her final words, we are told, were not of God or kings, but of her daughter. She dies alone, in exile. A queen in name only. Historians still debate the legacy of Caroline Matilda and Struensee. Were they naive idealists, foolish lovers, political martyrs? Some call it the last gasp of Enlightenment hope, before Denmark snapped shut again like a book no one wanted to finish. Others say it was inevitable, two people trying to change a kingdom too rigid to bend. But there's something haunting in the stillness of her ending. No scandal, no rebellion, just a bed in a borrowed palace, and a woman who once dreamed of light now fading quietly into shadow. You leave the chamber in silence, the floor cool beneath your steps. The wind catches your sleeve as you pass a tall window. Beyond it, a statue of a riderless horse stands in the garden forgotten, dignified and utterly still. And now you return to England to meet a man who, like Caroline, defied expectation and paid for it not with poison, but with a blade. Only this time, the blade comes in the dark, from someone he trusted. The rain doesn't fall here it presses. It slants sideways, flings itself at the stone walls, and slips down into cracks that were already old before your great-great-grandparents could say majesty. The wind howls through the arrow slits of Berkeley Castle. But it's not just wind. It sounds almost vocal, like someone whispering a warning in a language that only ghosts speak. Inside, it's worse. The corridors are damp and dark, lit by sputtering torches that throw light in nervous bursts. The stone walls seem to sweat. The scent of damp stone rises again, thicker now, tangled with the sharp bite of iron and the slow rot of old despair. You pass guards who don't meet your eye. They've been stationed here too long enough to forget what light smells like, and at the top of a narrow winding staircase, in a chamber without windows, a man who used to be king stares into the dark. Edward II of England, a monarch brought low not by disease or sword, but by love, scandal, and possibly the most infamous poker in European history. Let's rewind. Edward II inherited the English crown in 1307 after the death of his iron-willed father. Edward I, a king who expanded the realm with brute force and famously conquered Wales. The bar was high, the expectations crushing. But Edward II, he wasn't built for the battlefield. He was built for music, for art, for romantic walks in decorative gardens, and possibly in ways that would terrify his nobles for intimate friendships with men. Specifically, one man, Piers Gaveston. Gaveston was Edward's companion, confidant, and, depending on which chronicler you ask, possibly his lover. Edward lavished him with titles and gifts, even referring to him as his brother-in-arms and giving him a role in royal ceremonies usually reserved for the Queen. The nobility hated it. They saw Gaveston as a parasite, a foreigner with too much influence and too little respect. His arrogance didn't help. He openly mocked the great families of England, once calling a powerful earl the Black Dog of Arden. Charming. Eventually, the barons had enough. They dragged Gaveston from sanctuary, put him on trial, and executed him in 1312. Zoom in. Edward stares into the fire, fingers gripping the carved armrests of his throne. His jaw clenches. He doesn't cry. But the silence that follows is deeper than mourning. It's fury. It's loss marinated in rage. He never forgave. Instead, he found a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. And this time, he didn't just give gifts. He gave power. Too much of it. Hugh Despenser ruled like a vulture in silk. He seized land. He imprisoned rivals. He allegedly tortured enemies for fun. With Despenser whispering in his ear, Edward became increasingly tyrannical. He arrested barons, seized estates, and alienated nearly every powerful family in the kingdom. Meanwhile, his wife, Queen Isabella of France, watched, waited, and simmered. Isabella had once been a child bride, sent across the Channel to unite kingdoms, but she was no passive ornament. Known as the she-wolf of France, Isabella was intelligent, politically shrewd, and not amused by Despenser's rising influence or by her husband's emotional distance. So, she did what any strong-willed medieval queen might do. When her husband becomes impossible, she left. Under the pretense of diplomatic business, Isabella went to France in 1325. There, she met Roger Mortimer, an exiled English nobleman who just so happened to be good-looking, rebellious, and furious at Edward. Their alliance became romantic. Their plans became dangerous. By 1326, they returned to England with an army. Edward's support crumbled almost instantly. Towns surrendered. Nobles defected. Even his own allies turned against him. Within weeks, Isabella and Mortimer had seized power, executed Hugh Despenser in a manner so theatrical it deserves its own opera, and forced Edward to abdicate in favour of his 14-year-old son, Edward III. Edward II was imprisoned, first at Kenilworth Castle, then Berkeley Castle. And here's where the shadow thickens. The official records say Edward died on September 21st, 1327 in captivity. The cause, natural illness, but no one really bought that, not then, And not now. Soon after, rumours began to swirl. Some said he'd been smothered with pillows in the night. Others said he was starved slowly. But the version that stuck, the one burned into England's collective imagination, was the red-hot poker. According to one account, Edward was restrained, held down, and had a burning iron rod inserted into his rectum. The theory was brutal and bizarre internal injury with no visible wounds. A way to kill a king without leaving a mark. His death scream, they say, echoed through the stone walls of Berkeley Castle and out across the fields like a banshee's cry. Zoom in again, a stone chamber, firelight dancing on sweating walls. A torch burns low. Outside, thunder rumbles. Inside, a final scream, muffled, long, and then nothing. No autopsy was ever performed. His body was embalmed quickly and buried at Gloucester Abbey, now Gloucester Cathedral. A magnificent tomb was built, expensive, elaborate, almost too elaborate for a disgraced former king, which leads us to the next twist. Some historians believe Edward II didn't die at all. Years after his alleged death, letters emerge, one even signed in Edward's own hand, claiming he had escaped captivity and was living quietly in Italy, under the protection of sympathetic nobles. These letters, known as the Fieschi letter, were presented to Edward III himself. Were they real, forgery, hopeful invention, or the truth? Historians remain divided. Some see the story of the hot poker as propaganda fabricated to cement the righteousness of Isabella and Mortimer's coup. Others believe it happened exactly as described, a cruel warning to anyone who would rule through favourites instead of through strength. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain: no one ever saw Edward again. Not publicly, not officially. The tower chamber at Berkeley Castle still stands, cold, silent. The walls are as thick as ever. The torch sconces are rusted but intact. The air is heavy with centuries of not quite answers. You linger there now, footsteps echoing on the flagstones. The scent of damp stone is overwhelming. A single droplet falls from the ceiling into a small puddle near the wall. Its splash somehow louder than expected. And that scream, maybe it never stopped. Maybe it just learned how to hide in the stones. You descend the steps, each one colder than the last. Because next you'll stand beneath a palace balcony and watch a king fall. Not by murder, for not by battle, but by sheer, spectacular, idiotic gravity. The sun over Aragon is indecisive, hanging just above the horizon, casting long, theatrical shadows across the tiled rooftops of a palace that smells faintly of orange blossoms, sweat, and something fermenting under velvet. It's summer, 1410, and the air is hot and lazy, like it has nowhere important to be. You climb a wide staircase worn smooth by centuries of royal feet, the stone still warm from the afternoon heat. Somewhere above you, a jester is running late. Somewhere else, a monarch is about to die, not by sword, not by poison, but by something even more absurd: laughter. Yes, you're here for King Martin the Rye of Aragon, sometimes called Martin the Humane, and in a world of royal death by staircase, chamber pot, and molten metal you'll get there. This one is different. Martin wasn't a legendary conqueror or an iron-fisted tyrant. He wasn't the subject of tragic poetry or scandalous ballads. He was, quite frankly, solidly middle-tier earnest, capable, mildly gouty, a scholar king, a bookworm with a crown, the kind of man who'd have run a very thoughtful book club if fate hadn't handed him a throne. But even bookish monarchs die eventually. Martin had been ill for days. His doctors called it indigestion, though given medieval medical standards, that could mean anything from gas to imminent organ failure. He was bloated, feverish, unable to eat, and most insultingly, unable to pass what needed passing. Yes, he was constipated, aggressively, royally constipated. So, naturally, he sent for his jester, because if you can't move your bowels, maybe you can at least laugh. Enter the unnamed jester, late as usual. He arrived red-faced and reeking faintly of wine, clattering into the king's sick room with apologies and a terrible story about a deer and a fig tree. Specifically, that he'd seen a deer hanging by its tail from a fig tree in the royal vineyard. Now, even you might pause at that one. A deer hanging from a fig tree. It makes no sense. It's not clever. It's not even really a joke. But something about the absurdity of it combined with the king's fever, exhaustion, and probably a bit of desperation made it land perfectly. Martin laughed. Then he laughed harder. Then he couldn't stop. And then, quite suddenly, he died. Zoom in the room is warm and heavy with incense. The sheets are damp with sweat. Martin slumps sideways, his chuckles morphing into wheezes, and then silence. His open mouth still caught mid-laugh, as if death had found the moment too good to interrupt politely. The jester reportedly froze in place. One servant screamed, another fainted, and yet another ran to fetch the court physician, who arrived just in time to confirm that, yes, the king was now extremely dead. Intestinal failure was the official cause, but everyone remembered the joke. Now here's where the real mess begins. Because Martin, that sweet, bookish man, had neglected to do one very important thing before keeling over in a fit of laughter. He hadn't named a successor. He had no legitimate sons. His only male heir, Martin the Younger, had died 2 years prior of plague, as it happens, which was basically the medieval version of a traffic accident, sudden, horrible, and terribly common. So the crown of Aragon was left with a dead king, no direct heir, and a jester in shock. The nobles panicked. Multiple claimants emerged, almost immediately relatives from Sicily, Naples, Castile, even France. Some had better paperwork. Others had bigger armies. One had a really convincing mustache. None had a clear right. The ensuing power struggle is known as the Interregnum of Aragon, a 2-year saga of political manoeuvring, backroom deals, and enough backstabbing to fill several Shakespearean tragedies. Eventually, in 1412, the throne was awarded to Ferdinand of Antequera, a Castilian prince and distant relative, after a council of nobles and scholars selected him through a process known as the Compromise of Caspe. Very official, very democratic, very messy. Zoom in again, a candlelit chamber with 7 grim-faced men seated around a heavy table, each trying not to look like they're lying. One man clears his throat. Gentlemen, perhaps we should consider who the jester didn't offend. The royal court split down linguistic, political, and regional lines. Catalans versus Castilians, Aragonese nobles squabbling with Sicilian ones, all over a throne that no one expected to be empty. It was chaos. The joke that killed a king nearly killed the kingdom too. Historians, to this day, argue about whether Martin's death was truly spontaneous or whether his laugh merely accelerated the inevitable. His documented symptoms, extreme abdominal pain, bloating, fever, confusion, could indicate anything from peritonitis to liver failure. Some suggest cardiac arrest. Others point to gastrointestinal rupture. But all of them include that laugh. Because how could they not? It's just too good. And, in a way, too cruel. Here was a man remembered for kindness, diplomacy, and steady rule undone by a joke that wouldn't land on Twitter. His kingdom tipped into crisis because someone mentioned a fig tree. Modern scholars even debate whether the jester's story was fabricated after the fact. A poetic exaggeration to explain an untimely death, a literary flourish. But the details, names, dates, symptoms are just specific enough to feel uncomfortably real. You walk slowly through the halls of the now empty palace. The breeze drifting through the fig trees smells sweet, almost apologetically so. Somewhere below, a servant waters the vineyard that supposedly hosted the hanging deer. No one's laughing now. King Martin's body was eventually buried in the royal pantheon at Poblin Monastery, a quiet place. Far from the comedy that ended his reign, his tomb, ironically, is quite severe. Cold stone, simple Latin script, no mention of figs, no mention of deer, definitely no mention of laughter. But the story outlived him. It crept into chronicles, echoed through legends, and quietly became the kind of tale that monarchs pretended not to be nervous about. Because if laughter could kill a king, then truly, no one was safe. You step out into the courtyard, the setting sun casting long shadows behind the columns. A breeze lifts your collar. Overhead, birds cry out, circling once before disappearing into the olive groves. A jester's cap, weather-faded and moth-bitten, hangs in the rafters above the entrance. Forgotten, but not discarded. You leave the palace with a smile you didn't mean to wear. It slips away quickly, because the next royal death it will be loud, molten, and delivered not by accident or laughter, but by gold, melted into wrath, The torchlight flickers like it's afraid. The flames crack against the bronze sconces, struggling to breathe in the still, suffocating heat. This is not the cozy glow of a hearth or candlelit chamber. This is the hungry, molten light of something about to boil over. You stand just outside the encampment, a sprawl of crimson tents and trembling Roman standards flapping limply in the desert air. It smells of sweat, leather, and dust that has never tasted rain. You've come to witness the death of a titan, a man whose name rang through the marble halls of Rome like a drumbeat of conquest, whose shadow sprawled across estates, slave markets, and entire neighborhoods. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Roman history and arguably the most ironic cautionary tale in the empire's entire, deeply dramatic resume. But before we melt him down, literally let's rewind. Crassus was not born poor. He came from old Roman money. But what made him infamous wasn't just what he had, it was how far he'd go to have more. When Sulla's purges left bodies in the streets and homes empty, Crassus swooped in, buying properties from the newly dead for a fraction of their worth. He even ran his own fire brigade, one that would arrive at burning houses and offer to help, only if the owner sold the property on the spot. Subtle, he was not. He used his fortune to build political clout, eventually forming the first triumvirate with Julius Caesar and Pompey. Think of it as Rome's most awkward power trio: one genius, one general, and one greedy guy with trust issues. But Crassus wasn't satisfied being the third wheel. Pompey had military glory, Caesar had popular love, Crassus, he had land, slaves, and a vault full of gold, but no battlefield to carve his name into, no monument soaked in heroism. So he went looking for it, and he found the Parthians. The Eastern Empire refined, precise. Rich in silk and cavalry was everything Crassus wanted to claim. Conquering them would make him immortal. It would complete his trifecta: wealth, politics, and now military glory. He raised an army, crossed the Euphrates, and promptly walked into one of the most humiliating defeats Rome had ever seen. The Battle of Carrhae, 53 BCE. Picture this: Crassus with 40,000 Roman infantrymen, sweating in armour under a punishing sun. The Parthians meet them with 10,000 cavalry archers, swift, ghost-like, never still. The Romans form their famous squares. The Parthians simply ride in circles, loosing arrows by the thousands. Their supply lines camels carrying fresh quivers, their aim devastating. By midday, the desert is soaked with Roman blood. Crassus' son, Publius, leads a cavalry charge in a desperate attempt to break the siege. He's surrounded, hacked to pieces. The Parthians catapult his severed head back into the Roman camp. Cheers erupt on one side, on the other silence. Zoom in Crassus, staring at his son's face in the dirt, realizes what he's done. Not just to Rome, but to his own name. He tries to negotiate. He's tricked. A peace meeting is arranged, but it's a trap. Crassus and his officers are seized. And then, the real message is delivered. According to both Roman and Persian chroniclers, the Parthians execute Crassus by pouring molten gold down his throat. The symbolism is so heavy it practically breaks the floor. A man who worshipped wealth above all things, choked to death on the very metal he hoarded. Not a sword, not poison, not exile, but gold transformed from prize to punishment. Zoom in again. Crassus kneels. His arms are bound. The Parthian general Serena stands above him, expression calm. Nearby, a crucible hisses over open flame. A servant stirs. The gold glows first orange, then white, thick, syrupy, and lethal. One soldier steps forward, gripping a funnel. Crassus's mouth is forced open. The gold is poured, not all at once, slowly. Steam curls upward. His throat burns from the inside out. His eyes bulge. The gurgle is muffled, but unforgettable. It doesn't take long. He dies as he lived, grasping for more than he could bear. The Parthians reportedly laughed. One noble said, "Let him drink his fill." And then, in an act of glorious theatrical cruelty, they took Crassus's severed head and used it as a stage prop. Yes, during a performance of the Bacchae. Picture it: a royal banquet hall, silk robes and clinking goblets, a Greek tragedy being reenacted in the heart of an Eastern court. The actor playing Pentheus lifts Crassus' pickled skull as if it were a prop made by stagehands, not a Roman warlord who thought he was untouchable. Historians still debate the details. Plutarch and Cassius Dio both record variations. Some suggest he was beheaded before the gold. Others insist the entire scene was poetic invention, propaganda to humiliate Rome. But even if exaggerated, the story endures because it fits. Crassus's death became a symbol, a warning, a reminder that empires fall not only to enemies but to ego, unchecked ambition, and men who think money makes them immortal. And the ripple effects, they were seismic. With Crassus gone, the first triumvirate collapsed. Caesar and Pompey, no longer balanced by their greedy middleman, turned on each other, civil war ignited, the Republic fractured, the age of emperors began, Rome changed forever, all because one man wanted to gild his reputation and ended up gilding his esophagus instead. There's a kind of grim poetry to it. The heat, the liquid metal, the transformation from man to myth via the one substance he valued more than blood. You linger now in the remains of that battlefield. The sand is soft underfoot, but beneath it, bones, thousands of them. Roman soldiers who followed a man driven by coin, not cause above you. The stars prick the dark sky like pins in a map you'll never finish drawing. The cauldron, still warm, sits nearby, empty now. But if you lean close, you can smell the gold. You can imagine it sliding, molten and fatal, down the funnel. You can hear the hiss it made as it met flesh. And maybe you understand why people tell this story over and over, no matter how embellished it becomes. Because sometimes, a man can drown in the thing he loved most. You step away slowly, the torchlight sputtering behind you. But don't exhale just yet, because the next king he won't die by fire. He'll die beneath the weight of his own obsession with scrolls, knowledge, and a bookshelf that really should have been secured better. You descend the stairs slowly, one creaking step at a time. The smell changes first. Gone is the tang of blood and brass from battlefield carnage. In its place something softer, older, dry parchment, melted beeswax, the faintest note of sandalwood incense still hanging from a candelabra burned out centuries ago. You're not in a palace now, you're in a library. And not just any library, but one once whispered about across continents. A labyrinth of thought, housed within the palace of Al-Mu'tamid ibn Abad, poet king of 11th century Seville. His court was a jewel in the fractured mosaic of Al-Andalus, sophisticated, sensual, just a little unstable, like balancing a wine glass on a sword tip. Here, in this shadowed maze of scrolls and dreams, you're about to witness a royal death unlike any other, not by blade, not by betrayal, but by books. Let's meet the man beneath the bookshelf. Al-Mu'tamid was a ruler who preferred metaphors to military drills. Born into power, he governed with a pen in one hand and a goblet of pomegranate wine in the other. His court was filled with scholars, dancers, and musicians. His gardens were irrigated by silver channels that ran with rosewater in spring, and his library, his pride, housed thousands of scrolls and codices, collected from across the Islamic world, North Africa, and Byzantium. He wasn't just a patron of poets, he was one. He wrote verses to his lovers on the undersides of pomegranate leaves. He composed odes to the moon, to wine, to rivers, and once, quite controversially, to his favourite pair of shoes. He was, as you might suspect, beloved by some and absolutely infuriating to others. And yet, amid the elegance, there was instability. Al-Andalus in the 11th century was a mosaic glued together with ambition and soft threats. After the fall of the central Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, Muslim Spain fractured into dozens of taifas mini-kingdoms, each ruled by princes, warlords, or men with excellent calligraphy. Al-Mu'tamid ruled one of the wealthiest Seville, but poetry could only keep swords at bay for so long. While his rivals built armies, he built libraries. While others trained warriors, he composed verses. He trusted that beauty true, refined, whispered under the stars beauty would be his legacy. And then, one night, something fell. Some say it began with a ladder, a simple, wooden one, leaning against the upper stacks. The king had taken to walking the library alone, late into the night, whispering lines to himself, occasionally stopping to unroll a scroll, then carefully tucking it back into its silk pouch. Zoom in. The room is lit by a single oil lamp, its flame trembling in rhythm with the king's steps. Al-Mu'tamid hums softly, searching for a passage he remembers reading 20 years earlier. His fingers trace the bindings like a pianist brushing ivory. The silence is absolute, until it isn't. A scroll topples, then a shelf shifts, then everything collapses. The sound is thunder trapped indoors. Shelves give way like dominoes. Marble busts of philosophers shatter on tiled floors. Scrolls and books and inkpots crash in a storm of knowledge turned chaos. And when the dust settles, Al-Mu'tamid lies buried beneath his beloved library. The servants hear the crash. They come running. What they find isn't a battlefield, it's a burial. Pages flutter like panicked birds. Ink stains the floor in serpentine rivulets. And somewhere beneath it all, the king moans. He's not dead, not yet. His leg is broken, his chest crushed, his left arm twisted at a sickening angle. But he's alive, clutching, almost absurdly, a manuscript of love poetry written in his youth. They carry him to his chamber. The palace physician is summoned. Leeches are applied, poultices prepared, verses whispered over his brow. But it's no use. Infection sets in. Fever burns brighter than any candle. He dies days later, delirious, reciting verses that no one writes down. His final words, reportedly, were addressed to the room itself. I should have built stronger shelves. Zoom in again, the room is quiet now. Dust motes drift through sunbeams like confetti from some forgotten celebration. A cracked inkpot still bleeds across a silk carpet. And there, in the centre, a faint imprint where the king once lay, surrounded by everything he thought would make him eternal. Historians are divided. Some say the story is exaggerated, that he died of old age, not falling scrolls. Others claim it was staged by palace rivals, that the collapse was no accident. Still others argue it never happened at all, that the tale was invented centuries later as a parable, the king too enamoured with learning to notice the real world collapsing around him. But even if it wasn't true, it should be, because the metaphor is too perfect. A poet crushed by poetry, a scholar buried by scholarship, a man who tried to outlive time through words, only to be undone by their weight. His library was partially restored after his death, but many of the most delicate manuscripts, those written on gazelle skin, perfumed with saffron ink, were too damaged to salvage. Some say they burned them in the gardens, others claim they were smuggled to Cordoba, where a few survive in private archives even today. Al-Mu'tamid's sons did not inherit his love of literature, or perhaps they were simply too frightened of falling shelves. The palace changed hands, and eventually the Almoravids, stern, desert-born, uncompromising, conquered Seville. They outlawed music, closed the wine houses, turned the poetry halls into barracks, but they left the library untouched, too sacred, perhaps, or too heavy to dismantle. You walk now through the remnants. Most of the scrolls are gone, but the scent remains papery, dry, with just a whisper of something floral, like jasmine fading in a vase too long ignored. You run your fingers across a shelf and pause. A single scroll sits there, untouched. You unroll it. The ink is faded, but the words survive. What is a king but a page before turning and you smile, because the next death. Oh, it won't be gentle. It involves tusks, an elephant, and a parade that did not go as planned. The earth shakes beneath your feet, not gently, but with the weight and rhythm of something ancient, massive, and very much alive. The air is thick with perfume and panic. Somewhere nearby, trumpets blare, cymbals crash, and thousands of feet stamp in awkward synchrony. This was supposed to be a procession, a triumph, a glorious parade of wealth, loyalty, and royal magnificence. But now it's turning into a stampede. You duck beneath an archway carved with lotus petals and watch as the crown of Emperor Rajadhiraja Cholas of southern India wobbles slightly on his head, right before the massive war elephant beneath him bucks hard enough to fling an entire history off course. Let's rewind, because this one escalates quickly. We're in the mid-11th century CE, in the golden age of the Chola Empire, one of the most powerful dynasties in South Asia, at its peak. The Chola realm stretched from the southern tip of India up into the heart of the Deccan, with trade routes reaching as far as China and the Middle East. Its navy dominated the Bay of Bengal. Its bronze sculptures still make museum guards nervous today. At the heart of this glittering machine was Rajadiraja Takst, warrior king and conqueror supreme. He wasn't just a king, he was a king of kings, with a name that translated to the royal who rules royals. Subtlety, again, was not trending in 11th century India. He was everything a proper medieval monarch was supposed to be: pious, ambitious, armoured in gold, and carried into battle atop a heavily decorated elephant. You heard that right. Rajadiraja wasn't the kind of ruler to watch battles from a safe hilltop or balcony. No, he wanted to be seen. He wanted to glow. He wanted to tower over the battlefield while sitting on a literal war elephant, shouting commands and poetry in the same breath. It worked well until it didn't. The moment that would define the end of his reign arrived during the Battle of Koppam, around the year 1054 CE, when Rajadiraja led his army against the Western Chalukyas, their longtime rivals. The field was crowded with cavalry, spearmen, archers, and chariots dustier than your grandmother's attic. Drums pounded like thunder, war cries tore through the sky, and in the middle of it all, like a crown atop chaos, sat the emperor himself, towering, radiant, and, unfortunately, very visible. Zoom in. Rajadiraja sits tall atop his elephant, golden armour gleaming, forehead smeared with ash and sandalwood. From below, he looks like a demigod, equal parts warrior and spectacle. His voice cuts through the noise as he recites a line of ancient Tamil verse to rally his troops. Then a cry from his mahout. The elephant shifts, an arrow flies. It doesn't hit the emperor, not directly. It lodges just behind the creature's ear. The elephant screams, and then everything collapses. The beast rears violently. Soldiers scatter. The palanquin tilts at a nauseating angle. The emperor reaches for balance but finds nothing but air and a tangle of velvet curtains. Rajadiraja falls. From atop a 12-foot-high war elephant, wearing pounds of gold-plated armour, directly into a churn of hooves, spears, and dust. The fall alone might have killed him, but what happened next definitely did. Accounts differ. Some say he was trampled by his own elephant as it spun in terror, crashing into ranks of friendly troops. Others claim he was immediately set upon by enemy swordsmen, who recognised the opportunity and swarmed him with the enthusiasm of scholars spotting an unattended manuscript. What's not debated, he died on the battlefield, surrounded by chaos. His body lost for hours under the weight of panicked animals and collapsing morale. A king brought down not by enemy cunning or divine wrath, but by an elephant. Zoom in again, the dust begins to settle. The royal guards pull back the tangle of trampled banners and broken lances. There, beneath a crushed saddlecloth and a twisted ceremonial parasol, lies the emperor, his crown dented, his limbs sprawled, his golden sword still clutched in one lifeless hand. It's hard to look away. This was a man who considered battle a kind of theatre, and himself its radiant star. And yet, here he is, crushed by his own stage. His death sent shockwaves through the Chola ranks, but it didn't break them. His brother, Rajendra too, reportedly rallied the troops, leapt atop another war elephant, perhaps checking the straps first this time, and turned the tide of battle. The Cholas won that day, but they lost their king. Back in the capital, the scribes had a conundrum. How do you memorialize a warrior king crushed by his own ride? The official version glossed over the awkwardness. The records praised his bravery, his heroic death in battle, and his devotion to Dharma. They don't spend much time describing the part where a 4,000-kilogram animal had a minor panic attack on top of the monarch, and yet the whispers remained. The royal court may have buried the embarrassment, but soldiers remembered, traders whispered, poets hinted in cleverly rhymed couplets. One anonymous verse even survives from the period he rode the wind but fell with thunder, which frankly is one of the nicer ways to say he got squashed. Historians still debate whether the elephant's panic was accidental, or whether enemy archers had intentionally targeted it. Some suggest sabotage, others insist it was just bad luck, multiplied by visibility and bravado. But no matter the cause, the symbolism lingers like the scent of damp stone. A ruler who climbed too high, stood too tall, made himself too visible, and fell like an empire's Icarus. The elephant, it survived. But records don't say what happened to it afterward. Maybe it was honoured, maybe it was quietly reassigned to parade duties, or maybe just maybe it remembers. You step back from the parade ground, the scent of crushed flowers and burned incense still thick in your nose. The banners have fallen, the crowd has dispersed, and somewhere, in the soft breeze that brushes the dust from the earth, you swear you hear a low trumpet call not of glory, but of regret. And next comes a death that starts with a laugh and ends with a dagger. The laughter starts as a ripple. You hear it drift across the banquet hall like perfume sweet, easy, but with an edge. The kind of laughter that doesn't fade naturally but hits a wall and drops. You step into the chamber, past crimson curtains and silver bowls brimming with figs and salted nuts. The air is thick with the scent of roasted lamb, honeyed wine, and sweat poorly masked by rosewater. You're standing in the palace of Seleucus III Ceraunus, a young king with a sharp tongue and a shorter fuse, two things that do not mix well with daggers. Let's set the scene. It's around 223 BCE, and you're deep inside the court of the Seleucid Empire, one of the largest and most unstable kingdoms carved from the corpse of Alexander the Great's conquests. The Seleucids controlled a vast, wobbly stretch of land from the Aegean to the borders of India. The ruling family had a reputation for brilliance, ambition, and the emotional maturity of a pack of hungry weasels. Seleucus III, known by the nickname Ceraunus, meaning thunderbolt, was all youthful confidence and imperial pressure. He inherited the throne at a time when the empire was riddled with rebellions, border wars, and court intrigue that made soap operas look tame. At just 18 or 19, he was expected to rule an empire, please the military, and look divine while doing it. He managed none of these things. Seleucus was hot-tempered, rash, and prone to humiliating both his enemies and his allies with sharp-tongued remarks. He strutted around in gilded sandals, flung coins at poets who bored him, and once reportedly challenged a priest to a foot race during a religious ceremony. He was not, shall we say, widely beloved, but he was alive. Until one evening, he wasn't. It happened at a feast, one of those royal dinners designed to show off unity and wealth. The room glittered with gold-rimmed goblets and polished bronze mirrors. Musicians strummed lyres in a corner, pretending not to notice how tense the generals looked. Seleucus lounged at the head of the table, draped in purple, tossing olives into his mouth like grapes in a Roman comedy. Then came the joke, a moment of silence. Then a sneer from the king. He turned to one of his personal guards, Nicanor, a man known for his combat skills and less flatteringly for his shiny, aggressively bald head. Seleucus raised his goblet and said, "When the gods sculpted Nicanor, they grew tired halfway through, gave up on hair and used leftover saddle leather instead." Laughter burst from the table, half genuine, half terrified. Someone spilled wine. Someone else knocked over a tray of fish. You could almost hear the collective inhale of 100 courtiers wondering if this was one of those jokes that would be remembered or regretted. It was both, because Nicanor didn't laugh. He rose from his seat in one fluid motion, eyes locked on the king. His face was calm, too calm, and from beneath his robe he drew a slender ceremonial dagger. One heartbeat, two, then steel met skin. Nicanor lunged and drove the blade deep into Seleucus's side just below the ribcage. The blade twisted, the king gasped, and in the same breath that once held a bad punchline, his lungs filled with blood. Zoom-in goblets crashed to the floor. Servants scream. The table splinters as courtiers dive for cover. Seleucus stumbles backward, his face pale with confusion. His hands scrabble at the wound, trying to hold in what's already spilling out. His crown slides sideways on his head, crooked now, like a joke that went too far. And then he falls, onto the very table he'd been mocking from minutes earlier. Fruit rolls across the floor. Pomegranate seeds scatter like drops of prophecy. Nicanor, for his part, does not flee. Some accounts say he stood silently, waiting to be seized. Others claim he turned the blade on himself immediately after the strike. One version, deliciously theatrical, says he whispered to the dying king, "Bald I may be, but now you're silent." We'll never know exactly what was said, because the court scribes, ever fond of decorum, glossed over the details. Officially, Seleucus died from internal complications due to political stress, which is one way of describing a knife to the spleen. Historians are still divided. Was the joke really the reason, or was it just the last spark atop a long-burning fuse? Some scholars argue the assassination was a coordinated hit by disgruntled generals. Seleucus had made enemies quickly and generously. His military campaign against Attalus I of Pergamon had gone badly, and his arrogance had alienated even his inner circle. Maybe Nicanor was just the blade, not the hand behind it. Either way, Seleucus III's reign ended after just 2 years, making him one of the shortest-lived rulers in Seleucid history. His death threw the empire into a brief spiral until his younger brother, Antiochus III, stepped in. He'd eventually earn the title Antiochus the Great, partly by undoing most of his brother's mistakes. As for Nicanor, his fate is unclear. Some say he was executed by dismemberment, others that he escaped in the chaos. Still others claim he vanished into the countryside and became a folk hero for bald men everywhere. But his legacy, unforgettable. Zoom in again, the banquet hall, silent and clean now, the bloodstains scrubbed from the floor, the throne polished. And on the far wall, a mosaic of Seleucus III smiling, eternally youthful, no sign of the knife that cut his story short. You step out of the chamber, the echo of laughter and a sharp final gasp still ringing faintly in your ears. Another king down. Another warning carved into the wall of history: never underestimate the quiet ones, especially if they shine under torchlight. And now you're hungry. But be careful, because the next royal death begins with breakfast and ends with the very last bite. The smell is innocent. Freshly browned butter, stewed yellow peas, the faint tickle of something herbal and sweet like thyme dipped in syrup. A tray waits on a worn wooden table, silver spoon placed just so. Candlelight flickers across the rim of a tin bowl. The castle walls are stone thick, but even here, a draught snakes through like a whispered secret. And in this quiet cell, deep in the heart of Erbihus Castle, a king is about to meet his end over breakfast. You're watching the last moments of Erik Sostinth of Sweden, a ruler once full of fire and ideas and vision, some divine, some terrifying, all of them now flickering like that torch in the corridor. His reign was brilliance edged in madness, a spiral gilded with silk and spiked with fear. And all of it leads to this, a simple plate of pea soup and pancakes. But first, you need to know how he got here. Erik Swiftolthindial became king in 1560 at the age of 27. He was no idle monarch. He read classical philosophy in multiple languages, mapped the stars with obsession, and argued theology with bishops who found him both dazzling and exhausting. He had grand ideas for diplomacy and warfare, economic reform, and scientific advancement. He also believed he could hear voices in the wind, that angels whispered omens in his wine, that certain nobles could smell of betrayal. He kept journals, copious ones filled with horoscopes, political equations, and meticulous tallies of who had looked at him oddly during dinner. His obsessions, by the late 1560s, had hardened into full-blown paranoia. He saw threats everywhere, especially among the noble Stur family, whom he accused of treason often without evidence. Then came the breaking point. In 1567, Erik summoned members of the Stur family for questioning at Uppsala Castle. By all accounts, it was to be a formal inquiry. But somewhere between paranoia and rage, the king snapped. He descended into the dungeons himself, sword in hand, and personally stabbed Niels Sture to death. When his guards tried to intervene, he shouted that he was merely correcting fate. 5 others died in what became known as the Sture murders. It horrified the court. It horrified even his allies. And it was the beginning of the end. That same year, Erik began suffering convulsions and long bouts of silence. He wandered his gardens at night, barefoot in the frost, muttering prayers to unseen stars. Eventually, his younger half-brothers John and Charles decided enough was enough. They overthrew him in a coup that was, by 16th century standards, surprisingly neat. Erik was deposed, confined, and shuffled from one castle to another for almost 9 years. But this wasn't a luxurious prison. By the time he arrived at Erbihus, his confinement had hardened. He was not a guest. He was a liability. He was kept under constant surveillance. His writing materials were restricted. His food was carefully measured, but even kings, even former kings, must eat. Which brings us back to that tray, February 1577. A bitter Swedish winter wraps the castle like a shroud. The guards shift in their boots, steam rising from their mouths. Inside Erik's cell, a servant sets the food down gently, bowing out quickly. The king, alone now, studies the plate, a bowl of yellow pea soup, thick and warm, and on the side pancakes folded, golden, dotted with berries. He lifts his spoon, eats slowly, carefully. Some say he smiled. Others claim he whispered something, perhaps a line of verse. One report insists he paused halfway through, narrowed his eyes, and muttered, "The air tastes like copper," whatever the truth. Within an hour he was screaming. The pain began in his stomach, a cramp, then a stab, then a searing burn that spread through his chest. He tried to stand, couldn't, vomited once, then collapsed. By nightfall, he was dead. Zoom in the soup sits cold now, congealed at the rim. A smear of lingonberry stains the edge of a plate. The king lies curled on the stone floor, fingers clenched, mouth open in a silent gasp. The official record lists natural causes, but no one believed it. Rumours swirled instantly he'd been poisoned, not with a dramatic draught or goblet of wine, but something slow, insidious folded into a meal. Arsenic was suggested, cyanide, perhaps white mercury powder, odourless, slipping easily into broth. Historians today mostly agree Eric was almost certainly murdered, but the details are foggy. Who did it? His brother John III, who ruled in his place, denied any involvement, but few were convinced. Eric had remained a figurehead for potential uprisings, a threat simply by being alive. Perhaps John had finally lost patience, or perhaps a courtier acted preemptively, hoping to win favour by removing a political inconvenience. Then again, it may not have been royal intrigue at all. One theory holds that the servant delivering the food was bribed, or blackmailed, or loyal to a faction that believed Eric would return to the throne. Maybe he acted alone. Maybe not. It hardly matters now. What matters is the absurdity, the symbolism. A king of dazzling intellect and cosmic paranoia, undone by pancakes, not by sword, not by rebellion, not by divine retribution, but by breakfast. You can almost hear the silence that followed, a royal death without ceremony, no trumpets, no procession. Just the wind howling against castle walls and a stone corridor cooling slowly in the dark. Eric was buried quietly. His tomb carries his name, but no great inscription. For years, his reign was an embarrassment, something to brush aside, a smudge on Sweden's royal parchment. But time softens, and memory, like syrup, clings. Today, Erik Thorstolntov is remembered as one of Sweden's most fascinating monarchs, brilliant, tragic, terrifying. His writings are studied, his madness debated, his death still whispered about with a strange, uncomfortable smirk. And yes, February 24th, the supposed date of his fatal meal, is still known in parts of Sweden as Pancake Day, because history, like breakfast, has a twisted sense of humour. You rise now from the ghost of the table. The air in the castle feels heavier, as if the stones themselves remember that scream. The torchlight flickers more than usual, and as you walk away, a gust of wind slams a door behind you. You do not turn around, because the next royal death, it involves an umbrella and the tiniest pellet of poison ever fired into the human bloodstream. The air is heavy, slick with fog and the scent of petrol. You're not in a palace anymore, not under vaulted ceilings or beside golden candelabras. No, this death begins on a bridge, a place of crossings, of endings. You're in London, 1978, where Cold War paranoia seeps through the damp streets like rain through wool. You hear the click of polished shoes on pavement, feel the breeze off the Thames, taste the metallic tang in the back of your throat, the taste of something about to go very, very wrong. A man walks ahead of you, Georgi Markov, Bulgarian defector, playwright and journalist. His coat is brown, his hair's thinning at the back. In his right hand, a briefcase. In his left, nothing. He's not in a hurry. It's his birthday. After all, he's 49 today, and he's about to be assassinated by an umbrella. It doesn't sound real, does it? But this is one of the most surreal, surgical royal hits in modern history. A silent kill ordered by a communist regime, executed in broad daylight, with the poise of a magician pulling off a card trick in a crowd that isn't paying attention. Markov had once been part of Bulgaria's elite. His plays sold out theatres, his essays were sharp, clever, sometimes dangerously so. And then, in 1969, disillusioned and increasingly critical of the regime, he defected to the West. The regime took it personally. By 1975, he was working for the BBC World Service, delivering radio broadcasts aimed at Bulgaria. His scripts pulled no punches. He mocked communist bureaucracy, exposed censorship, called out Todor Zhivkov, Bulgaria's long-reigning dictator, by name and act roughly equivalent to poking a wasp nest with a very sharp stick. Zhivkov was not amused, and so a plan began to form. Not a loud plan, no car bombs, no noisy gunmen, no screaming, just a poke. Zoom in September 7th, 1978. Georgy Markov crosses Waterloo Bridge on his way to work at the BBC. It's just past 1 p.m. The sky is grey. Commuters move around him like fish in a slow current. Behind him, a man approaches. He's wearing a dark coat, hat pulled low. He carries an umbrella, not unusual in London, even when it's not raining. The man slows, falls in step behind Markov, and when they near a bus stop, a sudden bump. Markov stumbles. The umbrella jabs against the back of his right thigh. The man mumbles an apology in a foreign accent. Markov nods politely, distracted, and continues walking, but he frowns. Because there's a sting. Sharp, unmistakable, like a wasp bite, a needle, a warning. Within hours, he's feverish. By that night, he's in pain. By the third day, he's dead. Zoom in again, doctors at St. James's Hospital are baffled. No sign of trauma, no infection. But Markov's organs are shutting down. His white blood cell count crashes. His body swells. There's one strange detail, a tiny red dot on his leg. Beneath the skin, they find a metallic pellet smaller than a pinhead, hollow and filled with ricin. Ricin, a poison extracted from castor beans, is lethally efficient. Just 500 micrograms, the weight of a single grain of salt, is enough to shut down cell production, collapse internal systems, and cause irreversible organ failure. It's almost undetectable. No scent, no taste, no antidote. The pellet had been fired, yes, fired from a modified umbrella, fitted with a compressed gas mechanism. It had penetrated Markov's skin, delivered its payload, and vanished into the bloodstream. The man with the umbrella gone, just like that. The autopsy confirms what no one wants to believe: Markov was murdered on orders from the Bulgarian Secret Service, with assistance almost certainly from the KGB. And this wasn't the first attempt. Just months earlier, in Paris, another Bulgarian defector, Vladimir Kostov, had survived a similar attack. Same umbrella, same ricin pellet. But in his case, the capsule failed to fully penetrate the skin. It was found before it dissolved. Markov wasn't so lucky. Historians and intelligence experts would later piece together more chilling details. The weapon had been custom-built possibly in Moscow's infamous KGB Laboratory 12, nicknamed the Chamber of Horrors. Its engineers specialized in exotic assassination tools, poisoned lipsticks, exploding cigars, and, yes, weaponized umbrellas. The operation had likely been greenlit by Zhivkov himself, or, at the very least, carried out by agents who knew exactly what kind of result their leader expected: silence, permanence, and a warning. Because Markov's murder wasn't just punishment, it was a message to critics, to exiles, to anyone who thought distance meant safety. Speak against the regime and we'll find you even on your birthday, even in a country that promises freedom of speech, even on a crowded bridge in the heart of the West, under a sky that looks indifferent. You feel it now, the symbolism sharpening like a blade. An umbrella, meant to shield against rain, turned into a weapon. A poet, struck down not by thunder but by precision. A regime's royal fury, condensed into a single drop of poison and delivered without a word. Zoom in one final time, Waterloo Bridge. The rain has started again, soft, steady. Umbrellas bloom around you like flowers of caution. You imagine the scene, the stranger brushing past, the sting, the widening of Markov's eyes. Not horror, not yet, just surprise. But within him, the wheels were already turning. Even as the fever gripped him, Markov suspected the truth. He reportedly told his doctors and his wife about the umbrella, about the stranger's accent, about the sting. "I've been poisoned," he said. And he was right. Georgy Markov was buried in London, not far from where he died. His ashes were later returned to Bulgaria after the fall of the regime that had tried to erase him. His name now graces streets, schools, journalism prizes, but his murder remains technically unsolved. The assassin, never identified. The umbrella vanished, the files fragmented. Some truths, it seems, dissolve as quietly as the poison they carry. And you walk on now, beneath the steady drizzle. The torchlight that's followed you through centuries flickers slightly in your mind, the damp stone scent curling at your feet again. It's not medieval anymore, not mythic, but it's no less chilling, because the next royal death, it won't come by dagger, arrow, or even pellet. It will come by beard, a long, glorious beard that when mixed with fire becomes a lesson in vanity, grease, and tragically flammable pride. The scent of tragedy, it turns out, is a blend of burnt beeswax, scorched wool, and singed pride. It coils through the vaulted ceilings of a stone chapel, seeps into the cracks of cold flagstones, and lingers like a secret no incense can mask. You're in a monastery now, stone cloisters, dripping candles, and the hush of voices that dare not rise above a whisper. There are prayers in the air, and also smoke. You're about to witness the slowest, stupidest, and possibly hairiest royal death in history. Meet Johann of Brandenburg-Ansbach, a minor 16th century German prince with major beard energy. Not a beard like the magazine cover kind. No, Johann's beard was biblical. We're talking wizard grade, dragon horde snoozing on it levels of facial hair. His contemporaries claimed it reached the floor when he stood and doubled back up when he sat. It wasn't a beard, it was a statement. Possibly its own zip code. And Johann loved it. He groomed it religiously, combed it with ivory tools, coated it with herbal oils and beeswax, let it trail behind him like a furry royal train. In portraits, he looks more beard than man, as though someone lost a monk inside a mop. The thing is, Johann wasn't foolish. Not entirely. He was clever in matters of state, fairly respected among his peers, and deeply devout. But like many men with excessive facial furniture, he had one fatal flaw. He refused to trim it, no matter what. The legend says his barbers begged him. His priest suggested modesty. One chronicler claimed the local fire warden once approached him with a pamphlet titled, "Your beard flammable friend or foe," but Johann waved them all off. His beard was his crown, his armour, his legacy. God gave it to me. He is said to have declared, and only God shall shorten it. Well, ask and ye shall receive. Zoom in. It's a winter's eve sometime in the late 1500s. Snow stacks quietly against monastery windows. Wind hums down the chimneys like a tired choir. Inside the chapel, candles flicker in iron sconces, casting golden halos on worn stone and whispered prayers. Johann kneels at the front beard, pooled in a graceful spiral on the floor, practically requiring its own pew. He's attending a late mass with his monks, cloaked in silence and reverence. And then it happens. A monk to his left sneezes. Just slightly. It's enough to nudge his elbow against the brass candle holder. It tips. Not much. Just a lean. A single beeswax taper teeters and falls, right into the tail end of Johann's beard. The reaction is not immediate, not dramatic. At first, it's just a tiny curl of smoke, innocent as incense. Then a flicker. Then the unmistakable hiss-pop of igniting oil. Johann doesn't notice. He's mid-prayer, eyes closed, until the heat hits his chest. Then panic. He leaps to his feet, beard suddenly alive, a writhing inferno slithering up his front like a demonic scarf. The monks shout. One throws a hymn book, another lunges for the holy water font. Someone faints into a pew, but it's too late. The oils he used to maintain that glorious mane, herbal tinctures, bear fat. Maybe even early forms of lard-based pomade have turned his beard into a perfect fuse. The flames lick upward. They catch his robes, his hair, his eyebrows. Within moments, Johann is not just on fire, he is the fire. He stumbles, screams, crashes into the altar. A tapestry ignites. The wooden lectern smoulders. Chaos. Holy chaos! Zoom in, the torchlight sputters in the sudden heat. The scent of burning silk, old parchment, and human hair thickens the air. Outside, snow continues to fall in gentle contradiction. The monks finally douse him with water, wine, even someone's soup. The fire goes out. But Johann is beyond saving. He dies that night, burned, blistered, and cruelly beardless. What the fire didn't consume, the monks trimmed away out of mercy. The great beard that once swept corridors like royalty itself is now a blackened memory curling faintly in the ashes of the chapel floor. The chronicles are vague. Some suggest he lived long enough to whisper repentance. One monk claimed his last words were "Tell the barber." He was right. Another claimed he muttered, "The Lord is my beard now." Historians remain suspicious of these overly poetic deathbed lines, but admit one thing: Johann's end was real. Whether through carelessness, divine irony, or a trick of fate's cruel humour, he died the most dramatic beard death in recorded history. And yes, this is actually in multiple historical sources, albeit in varying detail. Some say it happened during a feast, some during prayer, but the core story stays the same: his beard caught fire, and he didn't survive it. There are fringe theories too. One suggests the accident wasn't accidental at all, that Johann's political enemies, fed up with his vanity and pious posturing, tampered with the candles or even sabotaged his beard oil, replacing it with something more flammable. Another whispers of divine punishment, claiming Johann had once boasted that not even heaven itself could humble such a beard. Heaven disagreed. You stand now in the smoky aftermath. The chapel is quiet again. The walls still reek of scorched hair and damp wool. One candle burns lower than the others, wax sliding down like tears, and in a quiet corner, folded neatly on a stone bench, lies an iron comb still warm to the touch. The monks rebuilt, eventually. The scorch marks faded, the prayers continued, but for years afterward, it's said that no one in that monastery grew a beard longer than their fist. Not for fashion, not for faith, not even for winter. And the phrase "watch your beard" entered the local dialect as a warning not just against fire, but against pride, unchecked and flammable. You walk away slowly now. The torchlight glows dim behind you, and the scent of beeswax still trails you like a lesson burned into your senses. Because the next king he'll die in public, but not at court, not in a duel, not even on a battlefield. No, his death will unfold during a puppet show, and no one will notice until the curtain falls. The room is warm with laughter. Too warm. Torches sputter in their sconces, wax trailing down the stones like melting promises. A faint tang of wood smoke and sweat clings to the air, mingling with roasted meat and the soft creak of velvet seats under royal bottoms. It's meant to be a celebration, a gathering of noble families, advisors, and curious onlookers in an over-decorated hall that smells vaguely of damp curtains and too many perfumed wigs. At the centre, a small stage, painted scenery, pulley-operated puppets, strings like spider webs, and somewhere among the courtiers and fidgeting guards, a boy king shifts in his seat, eyes bright, posture trying to mirror the calm authority he's been told he should project by now. His name is Ladislaus the Posthumous, and he has no idea he's about to die before the final puppet even finishes its bow. Let's wind back. He was born into silence. Literally. Ladislaus entered the world in 1440, a few months after his father, Albert III of the Habsburg dynasty, died unexpectedly, probably of dysentery, because history is consistent if nothing else. That posthumous birth gave Ladislaus his famous nickname, which, if we're being honest, sounds more like a failed stage magician than a European monarch. But Posthumus stuck. He never knew his father, never knew much peace, either. From the moment he let out his first royal wail, his existence was a political chessboard. 3 crowns, Hungary, Bohemia, and Austria claimed him as king. None of them agreed on who should actually raise him. While technically royal in all 3 realms, Ladislaus became more pawn than prince. His childhood reads like a custody battle fought in 5 languages. Hungary wanted him, but wasn't sure who'd rule in his name. Austria had powerful nobles ready to protect his claim by locking him in various castles. Bohemia did their best impression of a shrugging emoji and focused on their internal dramas. The result: Ladislaus bounced between regents and cities like an expensive piece of diplomatic crockery. By his teens, he was finally allowed to sit on a throne. Not wield power, just sit ceremonially, look the part, smile, try not to faint. And now, in 1457, he's 17 years old, nearly a man, nervous, idealistic, and eager to step out from behind the velvet curtain of advisors who've been controlling his life since the bassinet. Which brings us back to this moment. This stage, this puppet show. It's meant as a light-hearted affair, comic relief, as one courtier whispered. Forgetting the king was within earshot. Wooden marionettes reenacting medieval battles and noble courtship. Painted dragons. Jokes about sausage theft. That sort of thing. The audience chuckles. Laughter like rain on polished wood. Ladislaus leans forward slightly. His cousin, Ulrich of Chelia, sits beside him, occasionally glancing sideways. Ulrich has his own ambitions, his own network of friends who wouldn't mind seeing a shift in power, but he's careful not to show too much. The puppets stumble across the stage, one chasing the other with a comically oversized spoon. Laughter rises. The young king tries to chuckle, too, and then his hand goes to his stomach, a twitch, a wince. The smile flickers. Ulrich doesn't notice. Neither does the audience, but Ladislaus does. The pain creeps upward, slow and sharp like the drawing of a blade through thick wool. He shifts in his seat, tries to straighten. His vision pulses once, twice, and suddenly the stage seems farther away. The puppets blur, the voices dull. He tries to speak, but can't. Moments later, he slumps forward, forehead gently bumping the edge of his chair's carved armrest. His crown shifts sideways on his head. A nearby lady-in-waiting gasps. The laughter dies. Zoom in the puppet show continues for a few moments unaware, mechanical, grotesque. One doll performs a jaunty dance in front of a painted castle. A marionette jester waves a wooden baton, and the king is motionless. By the time anyone realizes it's not a feint or a joke, it's too late. He's barely breathing. The show is halted, curtains drawn. A physician is rushed in, a portly man with shaking hands who mutters prayers under his breath while checking the young monarch's pulse. Within hours, Ladislaus is dead, 17 years old. He dies quietly in his chamber, surrounded by advisors who had spent most of his life speaking for him. The same men who once debated his royal diapers now debate his royal coffin. So, what happened? That depends on who you ask. The official cause leukemia, sudden onset, no warning, but that answer never sat well. Not then, not now, almost immediately. Rumours of poison began to whisper through the velvet halls. Some blamed George of Podbrady, a Bohemian noble with impeccable timing and far too many ambitions. Others pointed to Ulrich of Chelia, the cousin with the perfect seat to observe, or perhaps orchestrate, the king's death. Ladislaus had recently begun asserting himself, reclaiming power, pushing back against puppet regents, maybe even planning to restructure his royal alliances. That kind of initiative makes people nervous. Some theorists went even wilder. They claim the puppeteer himself was a conspirator hired by one of Ladislaus's enemies to release a perfumed vapour during the show, laced with subtle toxins. Not enough to kill a healthy man outright, but enough to tip the balance in a sickly one. It's fanciful, of course. No evidence ever confirmed it, but no one ever disproved it either. Zoom in again, a puppet lies face down on the stage. Its painted smile faded. In Ladislaus's chamber, the torches burn low. His body's already being prepared for burial. Across the continent, monarchs sip their wine and pretend to grieve, and his death, it fractures kingdoms. Austria splinters, Hungary erupts into chaos, Bohemia races to fill the void, and George of Podbrady, coincidentally, ends up crowned King of Bohemia not long after. Coincidence? Historians argue to this day. Some say it was leukemia, a young man who never had a chance, struck down by fate. Others say it was a coup wrapped in tinsel, a power play with puppets. Either way, Ladislaus remains a symbol not of strength or strategy, but of what happens when your entire life is manipulated by others. He never got to rule, never got to speak without someone whispering in his ear. Even his death was tangled in strings he didn't see until it was too late. You leave the room now. The scent of varnish and dust still lingers. A tiny marionette still swings gently in a draught, its strings tangled, its arms frozen mid-wave, and the next king he'll try to escape his fate. Literally by climbing out of a window, naked, in winter. The winter night bites like a starving thing. It gnaws at your fingertips, seeps beneath your cloak, rattles old shutters like bones in a tin box. You're standing on the upper floor of a thick stone tower walls cold with condensation. A single, narrow window carved like an afterthought into the stone. It's high. Too high. And behind you, pacing in anxious circles, is King Erik Fufiv of Denmark, who is absolutely, positively not supposed to be here. But he is. And he's about to try the dumbest and final escape of his royal life. Let's step back. It's 1286 and Erik, nicknamed Erik Glipping, possibly for the sound his political reputation makes when it implodes, has been king since the tender age of 10. His father was murdered in a church because Denmark has a real flair for dramatic transitions. Erik's mother ruled as regent for years while he grew into his crown, which he wore with more charm than caution. He liked poetry, he liked hunting, he liked women. Too much, if you ask the Danish nobility, who are growing increasingly sick of Erik's autocratic style, his tendency to override local laws, and his rumoured fondness for other men's wives. Not great for a medieval monarch with a fragile grip on power and a few too many enemies with swords. Now, the line between rumour and truth gets fuzzy here. According to chronicles and one especially dramatic court poet, Erik's final scandal involved a nobleman's wife, a bedroom door left unlocked, and the sort of diplomatic outreach that leaves everyone blushing and brandishing torches. What we know for sure is this. On November 22nd, 1286, Erik Vai was staying in the royal manor at Finderup, a quiet hunting lodge tucked into the Danish countryside. That night, after a feast and probably a few too many goblets of mead, he retired to bed, unarmed, and, depending on which source you read, either shirtless or stark naked, it's cold. He's asleep. And then the door creaks. Zoom in. 8 to 12 men, hooded, cloaked, swords drawn, creep into his bedchamber. They surround his bed. He wakes just as the first blade slashes. Erik tries to run. Whether he reaches the door or not is debated. Some claim he was butchered in bed. Others say he leapt up, bare feet slapping stone, blood streaking the floor behind him as he lunged for the shuttered window. One source insists, probably with some creative license, that he actually made it out, scrambling halfway down the tower before slipping, screaming, and vanishing into the darkness below. But let's stay with the more accepted version. Erik was stabbed 56 times. Yes, 56. In the chest, in the face, in the arms as he tried to shield himself. The chroniclers, often gory in their details, said the blood soaked through the wooden floorboards and onto the table below, where his pages sat in stunned silence. The torchlight flickers, the wind claws at the shutters, and the king, once so full of songs and flirtations, lies dead on a hunting lodge floor, his skin cooling, his eyes open in dumb surprise. So, who did it? Well, that's where things get royal murder-level messy. The culprits were never formally identified. No trials, no confessions, no public hangings. But suspicion fell immediately on a group of nobles, chiefly Stig Andersen Vid, Denmark's marshal, who had motive, opportunity, and a grudge the size of Greenland. He'd been dismissed by Erik earlier that year under accusations of disloyalty and possibly treason. His property was seized, his family disgraced. And then suddenly, the king turns up full of holes. Stig fled the country, landing in exile in Norway, where he allegedly tried to stir up naval raids against Denmark and spent the rest of his life denying everything while enjoying suspiciously luxurious accommodations. Other nobles joined him in flight. Some historians argue it was a coordinated political assassination, not a jealous husband thing. A coup disguised as vengeance, a message you rule through us, or not at all. And let's be real, 56 stab wounds isn't a crime of passion, it's a committee project. Zoom in again, the tower window, cold and narrow. Snow has started to fall. The scent of blood still lingers, mixed with pine resin and smoke. And somewhere, a page boy is whispering prayers in the corner, eyes squeezed shut, hoping it's all a dream. But the king is dead, and the monarchy thrown into crisis. Erik's young son, also named Erik because royal families are wildly creative with names, eventually took the throne, but his reign was plagued with instability, weak alliances, and constant threats of rebellion. The nobles had made their point, and Denmark, it learned a new proverb. Don't fall asleep near a window during a coup. Okay, that one's not real, but it should be, because the symbolism lingers: a king, cornered, bleeding, possibly trying to escape through a narrow slice of sky, brought down not by invaders or assassins from afar, but by his own people, in his own bed, in his own country. You step away now. The wind follows you down the corridor like a curious ghost. You glance back at the window, half expecting a pale face to peer through it, but there's nothing. Just the dark, and the cold, and the next royal death. It won't involve stabbing. It will involve a wooden chest, one meant to protect, not kill, and a ruler who climbs in and is forgotten. The chest is older than the castle around it. Cedarwood, iron-bound, its lid scuffed with fingerprints and scrawled prayers from another age. It's meant to store vestments or tax scrolls or battle flags too bloodstained to display. Not a king, and yet, one dusk-soaked evening, it does. You're standing in a storage corridor of some forgotten keep, the kind where the dust never really settles, and the only light comes from a torch that crackles beside you. The scent of dry wood and wax fills your lungs. Behind you, soft footfalls, rushed, desperate. Then he appears, Władysław III, King of Poland, King of Hungary, child of 2 crowns and victim of one very bad plan. He's young, barely 20, the kind of royal who still dreams of glory and assumes horses will never throw him, and at this moment, he's running for his life. But let's step back first. Władysław was born into a Europe bristling with war. His father ruled a swath of land that was never entirely stable. By the time Władysław came of age, the Ottoman Empire was pushing westward like a thundercloud. Constantinople wasn't yet conquered, but everyone could feel the tremors coming. Fear was ripe. Popes were preaching. Knights were sharpening blades and dusting off crusader banners. And Władysław was eager to be remembered. In 1444, at the age of 20, he led a Christian army south to meet the Ottomans at the Black Sea port of Varna. It was called a crusade, but most modern historians would label it a catastrophic mess wrapped in religious enthusiasm and bad logistics. The Christian army was a patchwork quilt of Poles, Hungarians, Wallachians, and mercenaries with shifting loyalties and minimal supplies. The Ottomans, led by Sultan Murad II, had cavalry, strategy, and the benefit of not being actively sabotaged by their own side. The night before the battle, Władysław received urgent advice. Don't attack, retreat, regroup. He didn't listen. At dawn, the armies met, and everything went sideways. Zoom-in horses screaming, flags snapping in sea wind, the dull thud of arrows into flesh. Władysław charges forward like a storybook hero, aiming directly for the Sultan's tent. It's a bold move, too bold. His retinue is separated, confusion reigns, and then silence. The chronicles go fuzzy. Some say he was cut down before he reached the Sultan. Others claim he made it to the tent and was beheaded on the spot, his severed head displayed on a pike to scatter morale. And yet, no one ever found the body, no armour, no signet ring, no royal sash or holy banner, nothing. And that's where the legend takes over. According to one version kept alive in monasteries and whispered around fireplaces, Władysław didn't die at Varna. He escaped, badly wounded. He was pulled from the battlefield by loyal retainers and smuggled into a passing merchant caravan heading west. Among the crates of spices, bolts of fabric, and amphorae of oil, there was one object large enough to conceal a man, a cedar chest, lined with cloth, padded with linens, heavy, but not suspiciously so. They hid him there, hoping to move him safely out of Ottoman territory, away from the chaos, toward the relative safety of Venetian lands or perhaps even the Holy Roman Empire. A king in a box, unseen, unheard. But then something went wrong. Maybe the caravan was raided. Maybe the rescuers fled in fear. Or maybe, chillingly, they were killed before they could reveal where they'd hidden him. Either way, the chest was left behind, abandoned in a warehouse, or sealed up in a storage vault, or mistaken for cargo and moved again. There's even one version that claims it ended up on a ship that sank somewhere in the Adriatic. The result was the same: he never came out. Imagine it. Zoom in the inside of the chest. Breath shallow. Darkness absolute. The muffled thrum of wagon wheels. Then nothing. Silence. No footsteps. No voices. The air grows stale. The king, bleeding and afraid, calls out once, then twice. then never again. Some say he suffocated, others believe his wounds did him in first. A few romantics suggest he simply fell asleep. The chest his last cocoon, history's cruelest cradle. No matter which version you believe, the symbolism is inescapable. A young king, full of ambition and fire, ends up folded into silence by the very ambitions that drove him. A man trying to become legend ends up buried alive by history itself. Of course, most historians scoff. The official version remains Władysław died on the field of Varna. End of story. But the lack of a body stirred centuries of rumour. In Poland, tales persisted of a cloaked figure seen wandering battlefields years later, blessing wounded knights and asking for news from Krakow. A few medieval texts speak cryptically of the king beyond the sea, living out his days in Jerusalem as a silent penitent, his face scarred, his name forgotten. And then there's the strangest twist. In 1515, 70 years after Varna, a group of Italian monks discovered a sealed cedar chest in a remote warehouse outside Venice. When they pried it open, they found bones wrapped in silk, a rusted dagger, and a small silver cross etched with the crest of the House of Jagiellon, Władysław's dynasty. The monks buried the remains without fanfare. The records were lost, or suppressed, or simply misplaced. Because history, like cedarwood, can seal in more than just air. You step back now from the edge of that mystery. The torchlight flickers across the floorboards. The scent of dry lavender and forgotten parchment still curls at the edges of your senses. Somewhere behind you, a hinge creaks, a lid lowers, a click, and the silence that follows, heavy, final, the next royal death. It won't involve battle, or suffocation, or betrayal. It will take place in a grand palace, in a golden bed, where the only thing more suspicious than the suddenness of it is who stood to gain afterward. The room is still, so still, it makes your skin prickle. You hear only the gentle flutter of embroidered curtains in the morning breeze and the faint hum of palace life beyond the heavy oak door. A chambermaid tiptoes across the marble floor, her slippers silent, arms full of freshly laundered linens. She doesn't expect anything unusual, until she does, and then the silence cracks, because on the royal bed, tangled in velvet sheets, lies a toddler, and he is not breathing. This is the death of Louis, Dauphin of France, son of King Charles VI, heir to the French throne. The year is 1391, and the future of an entire kingdom has just slipped from its bed and shattered, or so they claim. Let's rewind, slowly. Louis is just 2 years old, plump-cheeked, wide-eyed, and adored by a court desperate for stability. He is the eldest surviving son of a monarch who, let's be gentle here, is mentally unravelling like a badly spun tapestry. Charles VI, Louis's father, once a bright and capable young king, has begun a slow, tragic descent into what we now suspect was schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. He suffers from hallucinations, violent rages, fugue states. Once, he forgot his own name. Another time, he insisted he was made of glass and refused to be touched. On one particularly infamous occasion, he murdered 4 of his own knights during a parade because he believed they were assassins. So, yes, the king is not well, and that means the French court is a pressure cooker. Nobles circle like hawks. Factions sharpen daggers both literal and political. The queen, Isabeau of Bavaria, tries to hold things together, but suspicion clings to her like perfume. With Charles in and out of lucidity and no clear regent, the next best hope for France is Louis this small, blinking toddler with drool on his chin and a nation's dreams stitched into his swaddling clothes. He lives in luxury, of course, raised in gilded rooms beneath painted ceilings, attended by a small army of nurses, tutors, and wet nurses, fed on goat's milk and mashed pears served on silver spoons. His crib is carved from walnut. His pillows are stuffed with goose down. His sleep is watched like the Mona Lisa in a windstorm. And yet, one morning, he is dead. Zoom in. It's early, a little after dawn. The sun is just beginning to crawl across the painted floor tiles of his nursery. The maid pushes open the door and notices the silence too quiet, even for sleep. She approaches the bed, pauses. Something is wrong. The child is curled oddly, limp, pale, his little mouth slightly open. She leans in, then screams. Within minutes, the room is full. Nurses, guards, clerics. A royal physician with wine on his breath and trembling hands declares the boy dead by accident. The cause: he fell from his bed. Really? Let's pause and examine that. His bed is not high. It's custom built for a child, with carved guardrails that rise to the level of his head. It's padded with thick linens, surrounded by rugs, and watched almost constantly. A nurse sleeps in an adjoining room, barely a few feet away. There are no sharp corners, no bruises, no wounds, no signs of struggle. And yet the official verdict is this: Louis rolled over, slipped through the railing, hit the floor at just the right or wrong angle, and broke his neck. Case closed. Except, not quite. Even at the time, eyebrows were raised, quietly, carefully, because questioning the royal court's narrative could be fatal, but everyone knew something didn't add up. Rumours began to whisper like wind in the rafters, that a faction in court perhaps aligned with the Burgundians wanted the boy out of the way, that his death wasn't an accident, but a murder staged to look like one. One particularly vivid account from an anonymous chronicler in Rouen claimed the child was smothered, possibly with a pillow scented with herbs to mask the struggle. Another hinted that he had been poisoned slowly over several nights, then simply allowed to die. There's no definitive proof, no confession, no arrest, but the pattern. Well, let's just say Louis was not the only one. Charles VI and Isabeau had 12 children. Only one would survive into solid adulthood and claim the throne. Several died young, some succumbed to illness, sure, but others like Louis vanished under suspiciously vague circumstances. Was it a curse? Some believed so. The Mad King was thought to have cursed his own line, a divine punishment for his unstable mind. Others blamed witches, or Isabeau herself, or the English, or the Pope. This was medieval France. After all, when in doubt, blame the Pope. But others quietly suspected something far simpler politics: a fragile king, a power-hungry court, and a toddler who, though innocent, represented control. Whoever held the child or controlled the child's regency could tip the balance of the realm. And if they couldn't control him, well, a fall from bed is tragic, but also convenient. Zoom in again. The nursery has been cleaned. A new child placed in the crib weeks later, Louis's younger brother, Jean, now styled as the new Dauphin. The same velvet curtains, the same floor tiles, the same silence that seems, somehow, heavier than before. King Charles. He reportedly didn't comprehend what had happened. On lucid days, he asked about Louis. On dark ones, he mistook his surviving children for ghosts, or stared at empty corners of the room whispering their names. And the court, it simply moved on. A quiet funeral. A marble tomb no larger than a cradle. The court chroniclers chalked it up to misfortune, and the torchlight of history dimmed around the boy who would have been king. But the metaphor refuses to fade. A royal heir, killed not by sword or sickness, but by something softer. A pillow, a floor, a whisper, a warning. Even in velvet chambers, even wrapped in silk and guarded by 20 servants, a crown cannot protect you from ambition. You turn away now from the bed, from the stillness, from the room where no lullabies are sung anymore. The scent of rosewater still clings to your throat. The torchlight behind you flickers one last time, casting your shadow across the empty cradle. And the next, royal death. It will not happen in a nursery. It will not involve a fall, or a whisper, or even a blade. It will happen in full view of the world under golden arches, in front of a coronation crowd when a crown presses too hard against a fragile, unseen spot, and something breaks. The ceiling is low, not dramatically, not menacingly, just low enough that if you're a little taller than most men, if you're walking a bit too fast, if you're not quite paying attention well, it could be the last thing you notice. And for Charles VIII of France, it is. The hallway is new, fresh plaster, recent stonework, still smelling of mortar and ambition. He's just come from a game of jeu de paume, the medieval ancestor of tennis sweaty, laughing, invigorated by spring air and royal applause. He ducks slightly, but not enough. And then, crack. The top of his skull hits the stone lintel, not hard enough to knock him out instantly, but enough to rattle something deep inside. He blinks, winces, chuckles a bit, A few courtiers chuckle with him. 5 minutes later, he collapses. Let's rewind. Because this isn't just about a bump on the head. This is the culmination of a young king's glittering as disastrous dream and perhaps the most absurd royal death in Europe's golden age of self-destructive grandeur. Charles V was born in 1470, the only surviving son of King Louis XVI, who ruled France with the subtlety of a strangler fig, quiet, ruthless, everywhere at once. When Louis died in 1483, Charles was just 13, and the kingdom passed into the hands of regents. Chief among them was his sister, Anne of Beaujeu, who navigated court politics with the kind of grace normally reserved for sharks and chess masters. Anne kept France stable, while Charles grew into adulthood awkward, thin-limbed, with a beaky nose and a romantic streak wide enough to park an ox cart in. He was devout, chivalrous, and obsessed with stories of ancient empire, especially those involving Italy, more specifically conquering Italy. At 24, Charles assumed full control and immediately turned his gaze south. The Italian peninsula was a fragmented mess. Milan, Florence, Venice, the Papal States, Naples, each with its own ruler, army, and self-importance. Charles believed it wouldn't take much to sweep through and re-establish a glorious French claim to the Kingdom of Naples, a crown he saw as his birthright through a convoluted web of dynastic marriages. What followed was a dazzling disaster. In 1494 he launched the Italian War, marching an enormous army across the Alps with artillery, cavalry, and royal banners flapping like they had something to prove. Initially, it worked. Cities opened their gates, Florence caved, Rome blinked, Naples surrendered. Then everyone realized what was happening. The rest of Europe, especially Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, formed the League of Venice, an anti-French coalition designed to punch Charles directly in his ambitions. The Italian people, once dazzled, grew resentful. French soldiers alienated locals. Plague broke out. Resistance boiled. Charles retreated, narrowly avoiding total annihilation at the Battle of Fornovo in 1495. He limped back to France, exhausted, broke, and still clinging to dreams of grandeur. Which brings us to April 7th, 1498. He's now 27, still young, still hopeful, and hosting a lavish court celebration at Château d'Amboise, one of the Loire Valley's crown jewels, a riverside fortress carved into limestone and history. The day's events include feasting, games, and exhibitions of the chateau's newly constructed passageways. Charles watches a tennis match, chatting amiably with courtiers. He laughs, wipes sweat from his brow, then turns to follow his wife, Anne of Brittany, through a side corridor toward lunch. The gallery ceiling is low, not drastically, but enough. He doesn't see the lintel. Zoom in the top of his head collides with the stone. His body jolts. For a moment, nothing seems wrong. He keeps walking, but within minutes, he begins to stagger. His vision blurs. He mumbles. A servant offers a goblet of wine. Charles collapses before he can lift it. He's carried to his bed for 9 hours. He lies there drifting in and out of consciousness. His physicians arrive. They prescribe bleeding, cold compresses, prayers. Nothing works. By nightfall, he is dead. The official diagnosis, a cerebral hemorrhage, likely caused by the impact. Some modern historians suspect he had a pre-existing vascular weakness. Others argue the blow simply broke a delicate vessel in just the wrong way, and yet others point to what he had been wearing earlier that day. A ceremonial crown, reportedly heavier than usual. Gold, jewels, ornate symbolism. A crown that may have exaggerated the angle of the strike or pressed just enough on his head, earlier in the day, to turn a glancing blow into a fatal one. The metaphor writes itself. The weight of the crown. Literally. You think about this as you walk the very gallery where it happened. The stone is smooth. Time has worn it gentle. But the doorway remains low, a quiet marker of one king's final miscalculation. There's a plaque now. Discreet. Tourists snap photos without fully realizing they're standing on the exact spot where a king's vision ended not in war, not by betrayal, but by poor ceiling clearance. Charles's death sent ripples through France. He left no male heir. His cousin, Louis, Duke of Orleans, became Louis XVI, marrying Charles's widow. Anne, and inheriting not just the crown but the messy legacy of Italy, which, spoiler alert, he also failed to conquer. The Italian wars would drag on for decades, pulling in more kings, more gold, more ghosts. But Charles, he was gone. At 27, he'd touched Naples, then tripped on stone. Zoom in again. Imagine that last breath. The candlelight flickering on painted walls, the distant echo of a lute, the muffled cry of a servant realizing the king has gone still. You stand at the edge of that moment now, the air thick with wax and cold limestone. The crown sits on a velvet cushion in the next room, glinting dumbly. It's so beautiful and so dangerous. Of all the royal deaths you've drifted through tonight, this one might be the most quietly devastating. Not just because of how it happened, but how little it changed. The world didn't pause, the war didn't end. The story just moved on, adjusting its crown, lowering its head slightly and continuing forward, like nothing had happened at all. But you know, you've seen the pillow and the trunk, the puppets and the poison, the vanished heads and the cracked spines. You've stood where ambition collapses and where grief is too politically inconvenient to linger. You've heard the chant of distant voices, smelled the dust of old crypts, watched candlelight shiver in drafty halls. And now, finally, the torchlight dims for the last time. The castle is quiet. The kings are gone. The weight of their crowns has lifted, and the only sound now is the wind curling softly through the old corridors, whispering stories that only come alive when the world is half asleep. The halls are empty now. Not abandoned, just resting. The flickering torchlight you've followed all night gutters into ember glow. Footsteps have faded. Robes no longer swish behind velvet curtains. Even the crowns, once so heavy with promise and doom, sit untouched on their velvet cushions, quietly gathering dust and irrelevance. You walk slower. The air is cooler here. The scent of damp stone replaces perfume and rosewater. No one is whispering anymore. No knives in the dark, no infants trembling in their cribs, no war horses charging into chaos. Only silence. And in this silence, there's a kind of peace. Because you've seen it all, the splendor and the absurdity, the rituals that end in betrayal, the coronations that never reach their golden twilight. You've wandered from cradle to coffin, through tapestries and trapdoors, through the exact moment power forgets it's mortal. And somehow, you're still standing, still breathing, still, awake. No need. Let it all fall away now. Let the pageantry dissolve. Let the candle wax harden and the bells stop their tolling. The kings are gone, and you are not. You've made it through royal deaths and whispering ghosts, through falling crowns and fatal lullabies. The world is quieter without a monarch.